Before we begin, please don't forget to subscribe. Number 1. I was with my boyfriend on vacation in Ithaca at the time. Just 10 minutes after entering the town, we came to a stop at a suspension bridge close to Cornell's campus. My partner was encouraging me to cross the bridge step by step because I'm afraid of heights. We paused in the midst to take a photo since it was so beautiful. In contrast to the parking lot and steps that were on the side from which we had entered the gorge, there were hiking trails without any obstructions on the opposite side. As she passed us, a woman asked to snap our photo. She grinned and immediately crossed the bridge to the opposite side, where she descended into the gorge after we declined. There was no hesitancy at all. In fact, it appeared as though she expected the road to continue. A person making such a jump leaves you with the sound of them striking the ground. I hope the unsettling stories are entertaining you. Remember to leave comments on the stories you would like to hear. Number 2. One of my friend's cousins had this secluded cabin where a group of pals were staying. Since there were no roads leading there, the hike from where you parked the automobiles took about 3/4 of a day. Due to job commitments, I was unable to leave at the same time as everyone else, so I made the decision to leave later on the same day. The final stretch of the trail is too perilous to be traveled at night, especially by someone unfamiliar with it, therefore I would have to spend a night camped alone. I didn't care, in fact, because I had never tented alone before. I was kind of looking forward to it. So as dusk fell, I was in the center of these forests. I put up my camp in this little clearing. Most likely 40 feet across. I'll start my campfire and erect my little one-person tent. Cook hot dogs on a stick over the fire and other camping-related activities. After dark, I probably remain up for around 2 or 3 hours. It was mid-autumn so the days were somewhat short. I always believed I heard something moving in the clearings surrounding woods. At first, I didn't think much of it because there are many of animals in the woods, but as the night wore on, I became aware that whatever it was kept returning to the clearing. When I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 loops before I took the decision to get up and look. As soon as I leaned forward, the noise ceased, and I thought I heard some sounds fading into the woods. I simply dismissed it, supposing it was a curious fox that became alarmed as I stood up. I decide it's time for bed, extinguish the fire, and enter my tent. I begin to nod off and maintain this state of being half aware and half asleep for a while. When I'm in this state, I frequently hear bizarre noises, so when I hear a voice, I don't pay it any attention. I am fully awakened, though, and I understand the voice is real and is speaking to me from outside my tent. It's barely audible above a whisper, and I'm not sure if they were speaking in another language or merely in English in a way that I couldn't comprehend. I stayed there for an unknown amount of time, listening and waiting for something to occur. I can see when a hand presses into the wall of my tent down by my foot because there is just enough moonlight to illuminate the tent walls. I suddenly sit up because I find this terrifying. Anyone who was outside the tent bolted for the door. Like charging through the woods at full speed. I exit the tent and look about with my flashlight, but there is nothing. The tent was not covered in a bloody handprint, as I had anticipated. I didn't get much sleep that night, so I packed up my camp at first light and headed for the lodge. Number 3. When there was a loud impact on one of the office windows just before the night shift at work ended, I got up and went to investigate. Someone has thrown a very large rock through one of the building's front windows. This is made even stranger by the fact that I'm working in the industrial area at 11:30 at night when no other businesses are open. I return to my desk, make a brief contact to security to inform them, and then make the decision to leave for home. I start stressing out more and more over it as I leave the building and eventually sprint to my car, get in, and drive off. When I realize that I didn't unlock my car when I got in, I'm almost home and have started to cool down a little. All along, it had been unlocked. I quickly examine the back seat with my hand for any potential murderers who could be lurking there, but nothing is there. In 30 minutes, I've contacted a friend who says he is out drinking, and I make the decision to go with him. I mount my bike and head over on it. I'm riding my bike aimlessly down the street, taking in the moonlight and the wonderful night, when I hear someone cycling behind me. I stand up straight and stay to one side of the street. He moves past me very slowly before giving me a smile that I can only describe as completely bonkers. He rides on, and I kind of cringe and feel startled when I realize that he is operating my mother's bicycle. I obviously race the fuck home. When I arrive, I see that her bike has vanished and that a door to my car is open. The left rear one. I had no need to open that door because I was driving. Number 4. When I was younger, I was fiddling with a radio and painstakingly sifting through the static in search of a signal. In order to get a much wider variety of signals, I had located an old television antenna, fixed it to the side of our home, and ran a wire out my window to it with an alligator clip tied to the radio antenna. So I'm sitting there, carefully sweeping frequencies in the early hours, like 2 a.m., when I suddenly find this station playing this incredibly strange crackling sound. It had a similar sound to cracking knuckles or perhaps Rice Krispies cereal, but it had a predictable, repetitive pattern rather than being random. After a few periods of listening, it abruptly stopped, and a tremulous voice said, "It is unsuccessful. Already dead are we. Already dead are we." The impact of the words didn't hit me for a second, but when they did, I freaked out and nearly hurled the radio across the room. Even though I'm very sure it was merely someone playing about with a radio transmitter, I was nevertheless frightened to death at the time. Number 5. In 1972, my parents made their first home purchase. Although it needed work, they planned to move in as soon as possible and make repairs as time and money allowed. The new neighbors came over to introduce themselves a short while after moving in. They also informed my parents that the previous occupants had left the property following a contentious divorce. Their relationship deteriorated after they lost their second child to SIDS. The fact that my parents were freshly pregnant and couldn't fathom going through such a thing further added to their horror. In the end, they essentially lost all memory of it. Life continued. Their new home and way of life had them completely smitten. They made the decision to wallpaper the nursery in anticipation of the newborn. My dad had previously advised against wallpapering the interior of the closet, but my mother insisted. When she saw something that caused her blood to freeze, she was knelt down and scraping off old paint inside the closet. "I killed the baby" was scrawled in crayon at around a kindergartner's eye level with a marker. Number 6. Well, I won't soon forget this one. My wife and I formerly resided in a townhouse that was surrounded by trees. We both took a day off work to complete some yard work, including mowing the lawn, weeding our expansive flower beds, putting mulch, and other tasks. It took around 2 full grass clipping bags because our yard wasn't that large. I would carry them a little distance into the woods and pile them there. Something in the center of the woods catches my attention as I return to the first bag's vacant spot. Something strange is moving in the wrong location. To get a closer view, I knelt down, but then I just stood still. I could initially make out a pair of shoes that were simply rocking back and forth, and then I could make out a teenager's body and legs. An adolescent kid who had hanged himself was there in the middle of the woods. I noticed a skateboard resting on the tree next to it. As I started to run back to attempt to save him, I yelled for my wife to contact the police and he was already gone. His head was just slouched over and his body was limp. His unkempt, brown hair was lazily drifting in the wind. The police arrived, immediately took him down, and then left. It turns out that he was experiencing issues with his parents and that's why he made this decision. Number 7. For my parents, I used to work in a trailer park. People would frequently start taking methamphetamine, start to fall behind on their rent, and end up being evicted. When we kicked someone out, their trailer was typically in such bad shape that it was useless. Essentially, we'd buy it from them and just tear it down to avoid having a trailer pile up in the middle of the park. Anyway, here's the weird or terrifying portion. These residents had kids in large numbers. I found locks on the doors from the outside in more than half of the children's rooms. The bathroom areas that occasionally appeared in the kids' quarters made it extremely obvious that the youngsters occasionally would be imprisoned there for days at a time. Usually, the edges of the doors and the door frames of the room's interior doors were scratched. I've always been afraid of starting demolition before getting rid of everything inside. I used to worry that I would stumble upon a dead child among the garbage. The chances of it occurring were, in my judgment, pretty high, yet it never did. Number 8. When I worked in retail, I overheard one of the strangest things ever. I used to work at my store, which offered layaway. There were 3 bathrooms located next to the layaway counter. A family restroom, a women's multi-stall, and a men's multi-stall. The only room with a secured door was the family bathroom, every other room had a push-pull swing door. I was cleaning up in the back when I thought I heard screams, so I went out to the front and stood by the counter. I could hear more yelling. The wailing and shouting continued even after I checked the men's and women's restrooms, which were both vacant when I first heard them. It originated in the family bathroom. I knocked on the door, but the shouting, crying, and yelling persisted. I had no idea what was going on because it sounded like a toddler. I requested a manager since I couldn't enter the building because the entrance was locked. There has been sobbing, yelling, and slamming the entire time. We dialed 911 after making many unsuccessful efforts to enter the door. Although we didn't know what was happening, it didn't sound good. It felt like an eternity, yet I estimate that it was just 15 minutes. The sound check came to an end then. There is no more thumping or sobbing. Up until the police arrived, we pounded on the door. When they did, they had to force the door open since we had lost the key. Blood was everywhere as we all stood around and peered inside. We were initially unsure of what had occurred, but when the police ordered us to back up, they pulled a woman and a child to safety. A 3-year-old bloodied toddler. We basically all stood there in disbelief. Because of all the blood, we assumed the youngster was dead because he wasn't moving. The woman was led away in handcuffs, and the youngster was taken to the hospital. Each of us had to make a statement. My manager informed me of what transpired later. He wouldn't stop crying, and she finally lost it and tried everything in her power to stop him. He was alive. I thought he was dead, but he wasn't, she had only knocked him out with her forceful blows. Although this story isn't particularly spooky in the sense of ghosts, I found it quite frightening because it happened directly behind the door when no one was around to notice or offer assistance. Thanks for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe. Let's get started. Number 1. My dogs and I shared a brownstone in an uptown Dallas gated neighborhood. For lunch every day, I came back to my house to let my dogs out. Men's cologne began to permeate my entryway and up my stairs after roughly a year of being there. I assumed it was my next door neighbor, so I didn't pay attention. When I opened my purse one day, I was surprised to see a $1 bill folded in half on top of it. I've never folded a $1 bill in half, nor have I ever carried cash. It seemed a little out of the ordinary to me at first. When I returned home a few weeks later, I found both of my dogs wagging their tails in front of my bedroom door. In my hurry, I walked them back to the office and imagined they wanted to sleep on my bed. There were about $20 bills folded lengthwise and neatly scattered around my room when I returned that day. I've never felt so afraid in my entire life. I grabbed my dogs and ran as fast as I could out of the place. I phoned the police, they arrived, and my locks were changed, but I could never return to my home alone again. My move took place about a month after that. You can find dollar notes stuck to the backs of photos, beneath furniture and in other odd locations when you move. Who or why or how did I not know? In my mind, the scariest part of all is knowing my little dogs were aware that someone had entered my house that day and was calmly waiting in my room folding dollar notes. Number 2. A horrific story unfolded in Jamie Closs' life. Last year, a 14-year-old girl from a remote Wisconsin town went missing after her parents were shot to death in their own house. Despite the fact that police arrived within 4 minutes or so, she has vanished. Of course, rumors abound that she was abducted, was complicit, is dead, or some combination thereof. Nobody has any idea because she's vanished without a trace. It's been 88 days since that fateful day when she runs into a woman walking her dog in the middle of the street in northern Wisconsin. Only approximately 40 minutes away from her house, she had been kidnapped. That's enough to make you jump, but here's the really disturbing bit. Despite the fact that he had killed her family and kidnapped her, she had never communicated with him. In the car on his way to a new employment, which lasted only one day, he happened to see her get on the bus. He made the decision to take her at that point. There was no advance notice of what was about to happen. There will be no grooming. Her family could have done nothing to prevent it all from happening. From 100 feet away, a nasty young man decided that he would kill her family and steal her for himself. Number 3. As a teenager, I aspired to be an adventurer. A few miles from my house, I used to pack a tent and some survival supplies and head up the hill for a night of camping, elevated 1,200 feet. I pitched my tent in a little patch of land surrounded by dense forest. I ate my beans and then went to sleep after making them. It wasn't unusual for me to be awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of a wild animal approaching the tent. Opened the tent at sunrise to find a white-wrapped, straw-tied package with a letter reading, "Welcome friend" on top. A calf leg/hoof is included in the package. To this day, I haven't spoken to anyone about it. I was terrified to death. For months, I couldn't stop thinking about camping, and I never went back. Number 4. For some reason, my dad's coworkers at the airport he works at found bomb-making ingredients in someone else's luggage at the time. Apparently, a suicidal computer science student had no intention of harming anyone. He intended to kill himself by putting the bomb together once he arrived at his destination. While his condition has improved, it still makes me a little uneasy to see him in this state. Number 5. In my 12th or 13th year, in our backyard, right in the middle of our back fence, stood a telephone pole. The electrician needed access to our backyard for a few days while he was working on it. My best friend and I were having a sleepover in my room one night, and we ended up in the fort we'd built. A half-hearted scream/yelp comes from her when I face her, away from my bedroom door, as she is shocked. She stated she thought she saw a man's face peeking out from between the sheets of our fort's doorway for a brief second. The rest of the night was a nightmare for both of us, but we eventually drifted off to sleep. A few days later, my family discovered that 2 of our motor scooters, which we kept in the back, were missing. My father later identified the electrician on Sacramento's top 10 wanted list. When he discovered we were awake, he must have entered the home through the back door and fled. That's the night he took the scooters, I'm pretty sure. Number 6. A blue tent, or at least the remnants of a tent, caught my eye as I strolled through the woods one day. It had been ripped apart, the poles snapped, and the pieces were strewn across a clearing. The area appeared to be filled with cream-colored flowers from a distance, but when I went closer, I realized they were only bits of paper. From Stephen King's novel, The Shining. They were burnt on the outside, as if someone had set fire to them, and the fact that they were all separate suggested that someone had intended to destroy the book. It didn't bother me. I thought it would be a great location for the film students from the adjacent school to shoot their project. Excellent work, guys. It's a little unnerving. A man from the next town over who had been missing for a long time finally turned up soon afterward, according to the local media. Dead. In the woods, in a blue tent. He may have been out when I passed by, but I couldn't tell you for sure. No one should tell me. Weirdest shit seen? Number 1. In Florida Medical School, I completed a rotation in forensic pathology. Was employed there one day when they brought in an elderly man who had been discovered in his apartment after roughly a week with no air conditioning in the thick of the heat, so he had decomposed pretty quickly. The bacteria inside of you consumes the tissue as corpses degrade and releases gas, which is why bodies often appear bloated. So I wasn't shocked to see it when they opened the body bag. His scrotum was nearly the size of a football, which surprised me, no exaggeration. It appears that the same bacterial process led to this. They grabbed a large diameter needle and inserted it into the scrotum to allow the gas to escape because I was acting eager and I believe they liked me. Then, as the gas was escaping from the scrotum, they lighted the needle's tip with a lighter so that it burnt like a blowtorch. Approximately 20 seconds long. They defended the method by claiming that it reduces the scent in the lab. Talk about getting to experience things that almost anyone else has. The blowtorch for the scrotum. Number 2. Similar to a tale my father had told me. In the past, paramedics were also sent to dead bodies in case they weren't quite dead but had suffered catastrophic injuries. I'm not sure if this is still the case. Dad was sent to a scene where a man, who was 400 pounds or more, died on the toilet after a heart attack. When he arrived at the building, he was informed that one of the apartments on the third floor was emitting a foul odor. He and his partner are led inside by the police after they bust down the door. Dad had witnessed similar incidents with elderly people, so when his new partner started to unlock the restroom, he called at the man to stop, but it was already too late. When the guy opened the lavatory door, a wave of decrepitude and crap shot in his direction. Both he and the officer seated next to him puked without any hesitation. Dad was never a squeamish person, so it didn't affect him, it just smelled like a dead, obese guy. However, the other guys had to put on hazmat masks in order to tolerate being in the room. The body wasn't in a tear-in-half state because it had only been decomposing for about a week, but when the coroner arrived at the morgue, he discovered that it had ruptured and was spewing death everywhere. In his own car, he passed out. Dad called a friend, who rounded up all the new guys from work, and instructed them to only bring their hazmat masks because they were going on a training exercise. He instructed them to leave the masks in the car when they arrived and to return later to retrieve them. In essence, he sent them in one at a time, and the majority of them emerged with vomit on their clothes, lips, faces, etc. It's his best hazing prank, he says. Number 3. Although a dear friend of mine works as a coroner, this may not be related. She gathers the corpses. Anyway, she told me this tale of an elderly, 400-pound woman who died in her home. She had few friends or family, it was winter, and her body was uncovered for 2 weeks. On a couch that was immediately over a heater, she passed away. She instantly split in half as they tried to relocate her. Number 4. I heard a similar story from a criminalist acquaintance of mine. A woman was discovered dead by her husband in a flat, hidden beneath the bathtub. Father informed his children that mom had left to go on vacation and would return soon when they began to inquire about where their mother was. This continued for a few weeks without anyone noticing until one day a neighbor next door called the police. The entire hall smelled like a cesspool. The body practically flew through the floor and down the ceiling of the apartment right below, the cops discovered. Number 5. Currently a board-certified fellow in pathology, not in forensics though. 80 autopsies in which I took part. Strangest/scariest incident, house fire, one body found after more than an hour of burning. Completely charbroiled, stiff, and with limbs tucked in close to the body before dissection, we radiographed the head, abdomen, and chest to check for any suspicious objects. There are metal pieces in the chest. Execute the autopsy. In spite of the considerable heat damage to the epidermis and soft tissue, the internal organs are largely unharmed. This is not unexpected, I learn. The chest has a sizable, greater than 1 liter, hematoma. In both the anterior left lateral wall and the posterior wall of the right ventricle, there is a 2 cm jagged aperture. Metal shards were found inside the left lung. A passage through the posterior thorax with a potential entrance wound in the upper back is discovered when working backwards from the heart. Oh no, was he shot? Detectives show up at the mortuary. Say they have the landlord or roommate in their possession. They are currently questioning him. He has a firearm. He's been having a lot of loud arguments with the deceased man/tenant, which the neighbors have seen and reported to the police. He denies knowing anything about it and has no idea what happened to his residence or the deceased man because he was not home when the fire broke out. When we tell the detectives he's been shot and it's clearly a homicide, they give each other high fives. We learn later, after the homeowner has been thoroughly questioned, that he confesses to shooting the roommate while he is sleeping and then setting fire to his own home to try to cover the evidence. He killed his roommate because he wouldn't leave even though he was actually his tenant. Very spooky. Number 6. I frequently followed a medical examiner, but the strangest thing I have witnessed kind of haunts me even now. There was a woman who passed away unexpectedly and had numerous bruises all over her body. Detectives and police officers surrounded us because they believed there may be domestic violence involved. She was psychotic, nevertheless, and was not taking any medication. She would severely beat herself during one of her episodes, causing all of these bruising and cuts. But she died in a bizarre manner. She beat herself so hard that these bruises turned into massive blood clots that escaped into the bloodstream. They ultimately entered her lungs, pulmonary embolism. When we opened up her lungs, all that was within were blood clots. They were also all on her legs. In essence, she beat herself so hard that she choked. It was really bizarre. Number 7. The University of Pennsylvania's medical school was where my grandmother's acquaintance was enrolled. She and her classmates were assigned to cadaver class, which made use of donated bodies. The friend of my grandma and her companion were given a corpse at the far end of the quite sizable classroom. When she took the covering off the cadaver they were given, she realized it was her aunt, who had passed away 2 weeks earlier. Yikes! Number 8. My father worked as a homicide investigator for many years. He has so many dead bodies. They were all gathered around a recently dead body that had just begun the rigor mortis process at one point. The body sat up all of a sudden. 5 mature men, all tough Texas good old boy cops, nearly peed their pants and fled the house yelling. The on-site medical examiner laughed heartily. Once, a woman's neighbors called to say they hadn't seen her in days, her car hadn't moved, and the mail was stacking up. So they went to investigate. When they arrived, they discovered that she had killed herself by hanging from the tall, vaulted ceiling of her living room. Her neck had already broken and her skin had stretched before anyone arrived. Her knees were on the ground, and her neck was about 5 feet long. Please don't forget to subscribe. Let's begin. Number 1. We received a call about a 23-year-old lady who had been shot in the head when we were on an ER rotation in medical school. She was already dead, but it turned out she was 5 months pregnant, so we performed CPR on her until we could get her to the hospital to see if the baby was viable. C-section was performed in less than a minute and the baby was delivered safely and quickly to the mother. Although it's not unheard of, seeing a kid born from a deceased person with their brain exposed was a little unnerving for me because she was around the same age as I was at the time. Number 2. Here's an ER nurse. I was performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, on a woman whose heart had stopped. It took them a long time to bring her inside the room because she was still asleep. This woman appears to have died. It was only when she was doing chest compressions that her hands reached up and clung to my wrists. We never heard from her again. Number 3. At the time, I worked as an EMT in Montana, where I witnessed an incident similar to the one I just described. It's been a day to remember. A few weeks after the occurrence, the young man was set to marry the daughter of the sawyer who had cut down the tree. Adding insult to injury, the young man's life could have been saved if the surgeon hadn't been a haughty jerk and refused to come in that day, very small town. He reached out to me 1.5 hours into treatment, I was bagging him, and everyone's faces were utterly relieved when the monitors showed that he was still flatlining. To this day, I still resent that surgeon for deciding that child's destiny after we all spent hours pumping fluids and blood into him in the vain hope he would survive. Over the phone, the doctor decided that his life was worth less than it actually was. Even while I miss being able to aid others, I never miss the feeling of powerlessness and defeat that comes with fighting these conflicts. Number 4. In the event that a code is called, you must always ask about a patient's DNR status before admitting them. When I worked as a therapist, I had a patient in her late 80s or early 90s who was both extremely demented and chronically unwell, in and out of the hospital every month barely holding on to life, basically a horrible miserable quality of life. DNR status is important because you don't want to put someone through a terrible resuscitation that may fail if they don't want to die naturally. I inquired about this with a relative who had medical POA, but I can't remember for sure because it was quite some time ago. That's what she said, plain and simple, "Oh, we want everything to be done for him because we really need his check." The family was obviously surviving off his social security and couldn't give a damn about his suffering or wishes, which confused me at first. I'm quite sure it was the spookiest thing I've ever witnessed. He was being treated like an inanimate object by people who were supposed to be his family members and who were supposed to be taking care of him. Number 5. My relative worked in a cancer treatment facility. Acquaintance was diagnosed and accepted as a patient by the doctors. The trashiest of rubbish was where this girl came from. In the living room of the trailer where they were living with their ailing grandfather who was on a ventilator, there were 6 or 7 of them. He was also being kept on for the sake of the check. The mother refused to allow her daughter to receive anything more than the most basic of care. As an adult, she was weakened and unwell after receiving a few radiation treatments. She said that her daughter needed to stay home and care for her mother's new baby. In fact, she gave up her oldest kid to care for her younger one because she couldn't be expected to do it all. After the death of their daughter, I was able to see the family a few times. Her death was treated with such callousness, as I recall. It was all about the bills and the loss of welfare because they were down to just 5 people in the family. The mere act of recalling this evoked the following recollections of her. When she was alive, the daughter struggled with her own problems. When we first met, she was about 15 years old and I was in my early 20s. She tried to have sex with me in a restroom by locking me in. I was reminded of another instance when a mother cornered a friend in the same manner. I'm convinced that they were attempting to raise children for the sake of welfare. Number 6. I'm a medical on-call night owl. For those who don't know, I'm a nervous wreck. I'm back on the ward where I started my shift about 3 a.m. to observe how an ill patient from the beginning of my shift is progressing. They tell me he's a lot better and the most recent obs are much better, but that his chart is at the other end of the bed when I talk to the nurses at the desk. I'm on my way to the patient's bedside in no time. The curtains are pulled back, and I use my flashlight to check his records without disturbing the other sleeping patients. All is well and I'm satisfied. Suddenly, in the darkness, I'm tussling with a slumped-over old man, who appears to have sneaked up on me silently. My own heart is racing simply thinking about it. I fly backwards, scream, and trip over a drip stand in the process. As he begins to scream, the nurses sprint over, one of them pushing the crash cart. At night Albert likes to go for a walk. Oh doctor, that is just Albert, he enjoys it. Number 7. Here's a former ER and critical care nurse. In the mid-1980s, 2 incidents occurred at a prominent Houston hospital. Medical professionals often accuse me of lying when I tell them what I really think. I'm not at all. Both come from the emergency department. A 25-year-old man is brought in by the EMS. With his hands outstretched and his head tilted, he appears to be discerebrate and is currently being handbagged. There were no tubes attached to his mouth or nose when he walked in the door. He was either inebriated or unconscious when his girlfriend found him in bed with another woman, according to the emergency medical services. She had a .25 caliber pistol with her, and according to the report, she pumped 10 shots into the patient's head from various angles with the weapon directly on his skull. After bouncing around for a while, they were able to enter the skull but not depart. Autonomic functions persisted despite the loss of all higher brain processes. One of the old Bourne's bare ventilators, crude by today's standards, was used to intubate him. He bucked the ventilator with deep coughs, as a result of this reaction. Pressure in his head/cranium, ICP, increased and small fountains of brain matter would be ejected from the 10 holes in his skull, many feet, when he performed this. I was hit in the face by one. Clinical distance insulated me at the moment, but I must admit that this truly impacted me. He died a few weeks later of a huge infection because there was nothing more that could be done for him. As part of an extreme sexual ritual, another young man had agreed to be mummified. Even his face was covered in a plaster cast and he was given breathing tubes inserted into the cast. Except for his toes and genital/anal area, he was completely encased in the cast. According to my understanding, it was deemed attractive to experience this level of helplessness. To compel ejaculation, it was common to insert a cattle prod or similar object into the rectus abdominis. Nonetheless, he was attached to 220 volts with one probe in his rectum and another on his foot, either through ignorance or malice. When he smelled it, it was clear to him that his entire genital and perianal area was covered with third-degree burns. It appeared like his rectum was bleeding blood, feces, and other bodily fluids. By the time we were able to remove the cast, it was evident he was already dead. We tried to resuscitate him by removing the cast. In the silence, we were absolutely unable to express ourselves. Nobody could speak when the police arrived. When I saw the situation, I volunteered to remove the cast and provide some post-mortem care. I discovered extensive scalds and burns on nearly every inch of his body. We took the body to the medical examiner, and I spent the rest of the shift shivering and vomiting because of my fear and anxiety. It's all right. Now everyone can label me a liar. But the truth is, I told both events exactly as they occurred. Number 8. The year I spent working in a psychiatric intensive care unit was an experience I will never forget. When I reflect back on it, creepy isn't the word that springs to mind, but heartbreaking and terrible. But there was a creepiness to it. Especially night and early morning shifts, of course. In the presence of someone who is hallucinating, there is always an unsettling sensation. On some level, you can tell it's real to them, and that helps you believe it. The phrase "and of course, I had to check my back to be sure" is a common one in many stories. You can observe the range of feelings it elicits. Here are a couple of tales to whet your appetite. A woman sat across the table from me during her interview for admission. Her arms were covered in bandages, and her lips and ears were taped shut. She didn't sit still and looked uncomfortable. When the nurse asked her a question, she would answer quickly by peeling back the tape on the corner of her mouth. The bugs were crawling all over her and were attempting to get inside of her at the same time. Using the tape, the bugs could not get through. To get rid of the bugs, she needed to apply bandages. Even as we sat and talked, she couldn't sit still because she could feel the bugs crawling all over her. Even worse, she had a vague suspicion that her imagination had twisted things. What if you went through your life feeling like someone was throwing buckets of cockroaches on your head all the time, all the while knowing cognitively that none of it is real? When I arrived at work, I found a girl fist fighting the same ghost for an entire 8-hour shift. A few punches later, she'd fall to the ground and twist her hand around like she was winding some long hair around her wrist. She had clearly scored several knockout blows. Her opponent would be dragged down the hallway, kicked a few times, and then set up for a curb stomp by her. When you consider the vivid images going through her head, it becomes scary. After watching this replay for hours on end, it becomes depressing. Number 9. A good friend of mine used to tell tales from her early days as a nurse. According to protocol, she was performing an examination on a patient. To treat a lung infection, he had went to the doctor several times and been prescribed an antibiotic each time. A nurse and a doctor had already visited him, and she was the last point of contact before he was discharged. It's a mystery to me. If you ever need a shirt, you can find one in my hole. Apparently, this guy had an enormous abscess and forgot about it until it was too late. At the time, it was so big that he could fit 3 shirts inside of it. Not telling the doctor or getting it looked out was a mistake. By the time the final one was removed, the stench was so strong that it vacated the entire room. Number 10. Despite the fact that I'm not a doctor, I work as a dental hygienist in the healthcare industry. In my opinion, this is the creepiest or most puzzling thing I've ever come across. They came in for their first dental appointment. A child of about 3 or 4, his mother said that he had never been to the dentist. I didn't give it much thought at first because it was so typical of what I see on a daily basis. Afterwards, I took his x-rays and completed his cleaning. At this point, things really went south. I was able to tell from the x-rays that the child had already had extensive dental work completed. He'd had perhaps 6 or 7 composite, tooth-colored, fillings. Once again, while I sat in my chair, I probed the parents about their son's dental history. In addition to insisting that he hadn't, they maintained a relative couldn't possibly have taken them without their knowledge. What's going on? What caused this? Who kidnapped him and took him away? What had become of the children? Had they been in jail for a long time and not realized he'd been to the dentist and had treatment done on his teeth by someone else? What if it wasn't their own child at all, but rather a fugitive they'd snatched? Insurers were unable to find any earlier records of dental work, so this was a dead end as well. I ponder it frequently, yet I'm aware that I'll never learn the solution. It's a pain. Holy crap, this thing exploded. Even if someone did read it, I didn't expect them to find it creepy. The truth is, I wish I had more answers for you, but I don't have any. I'm very sure the family never returned for his regular cleanings, as far as I know. I can only pray that the child is safe and well cared for, no matter what the circumstances may be. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and enjoy the following 12 true stories from real people. Number 1. Cops are his father in profession. Laws. He was called to a suicide by hanging incident years ago. The body had lain there for some time before I discovered it. Because his spine snapped and his neck hung down many feet from the noose, it appears that the dead had done quite an amount of damage to his neck vertebrae. A photo of giraffe neck was taken by the responding officers, who then circulated it around their colleagues. Even though she was only 12, my wife was exposed to the images, and as a result, she's turned out to be an excellent match for a person like me. Number 2. My lecturer is to blame, not me. At the tender age of 15, this youngster was playing with a loaded gun and shot himself in the face, accidentally. He then smeared blood on the wall in an attempt to scrawl the words "Help me." That's terrible. To prepare for class, I showed the students images of the actual incident. Wow, that was a lot of work. This is the most popular comment of all time, and it's not even mine. For those who have questions, the case's details were never made public, including where it happened, name, or circumstances surrounding it. We heard about a lot of interesting examples, but we never understood what happened to them because my professor didn't know the final outcome in a lot of them. No CS for me, as I ended up working in an FS lab. Number 3. Gunshot wounds with each hand, one at the entrance, one at the exit, self-inflicted. Neighbors say they've seen 2 expended round casings and 2 gunshots. The ceiling, walls, furniture, and windows are entirely free of any signs of gunshots. For an hour, I and 2 police officers scoured the area for bullets, but none were found. I'm at a loss for words. Edit. Okay, sleuths, take a deep breath and relax. It was a textbook suicide, complete with a suicide note that had been signed by the victim. The dead had 2 guns, one in each hand, and both were discharged. Wounded victims could not get away into the night because there were no open windows or doors nearby. There was no movement. Even though there was no murder and no evidence of gunshots, I'm withholding information about the deceased's identity so that you can figure it out for yourselves. It's been a long time since we've had this conversation. Only a few inches separate an exit wound from an entry wound, yet he wasn't moving at all. My email is a shrine to long-forgotten saints who shed untold tears. Number 4. In college, I majored in anthropology with an emphasis on forensic anthropology, thus I'm not technically qualified to answer any forensic questions. The Forensic Science Quarterly was a regular source of information for me. Here are a few that come to mind. In a 6-story dorm, a kid was discovered on top of an elevator. As ridiculous as it sounds, he was elevator surfing. He'd gotten his head tangled up in the wires a few of times when it got trapped in the way. He was not immediately killed by this incident. As a result of asphyxiation, he died. Thus, his time to reflect on what happened before passing out ranged from a few seconds to a few minutes. An additional one was a little more of a conundrum. A body was discovered in a truck in a national park without a head. No further remains of the deceased were found nearby. The truck had been started, but the petrol tank was empty. The wound was nearly like a guillotine cut, with no sawing. The investigators were baffled at first, but they soon discovered a receipt in his pocket for 50 feet of nylon rope, solving their mystery. A noose was found attached to one end of the rope once they broadened their inquiry. Further exploration of this location uncovered a head after some time of searching. It's an unusual manner of ending one's life. The mystery has now been solved. There was an officer engaged in this event, and he shared it with me directly. A 50-year-old black lady has been found dead in a garage, according to the police. A 35-year-old Caucasian male was found to be the culprit after an investigation. Watching porn in his garage while strangling himself with the garage door opener was quite the experience for this guy. The remote's battery died, and so did his. .30-06 and A.308 were used by a man who wanted to take his own life, and I recall that case vividly. Those are two extremely potent calibers for the benefit of the non-gun community. Overkill in the extreme. In any case, this dude manages to tuck two weapons under his chin while laying in bed and simultaneously discharge them. This is going to obliterate his skull. I mean, there was only a stump left. That isn't the reason why the case has stayed with me. That's what occurred next. The skull was reconstructed by local forensic agencies as an experiment. There are no missing pieces, save for the orbital sockets that dissolved. Even with the bug-eyed appearance, the final product closely resembled the victim. What happened before and after that is something I won't soon forget. Number 5. Forensic scientist buddy of mine worked only on burglary cases. I'm notorious for coming up with dreary stories to share with strangers. However, her only excellent story is that she examined a pair of gloves found at the crime site and discovered that they contained something solid. To get it out, she lifted the gloves, and a thumb fell out, ripped at the first joint. While his accomplice crawled under the safe, this thief held up the safe, dropped the safe on his hands, and ripped them out before fleeing. The man was obviously apprehended by the police. Number 6. Despite the fact that I'm not a forensic scientist, a true story is nevertheless a nice one. An officer I used to know told me about the suicide of this young man. As soon as the kid's parents had departed for the day, the kid made a snap decision. Having snatched up his father's shotgun, he sank on the couch. He pulled the trigger with the shotgun in his mouth. The entire chamber and ceiling were coated in blood, brain matter, and human teeth. Back of his head had been blasted open by the blow. He slid down the barrel because he had the rifle in his mouth. The parents returned home to find their son sitting on the couch with a shotgun in his mouth protruding from the back of his head. Number 7. If you've ever been to a pathologist's lecture, you may have heard him ask the audience what household object someone had managed to kill himself with. Later, he revealed that someone had accidentally murdered themselves while cleaning their ears with matchsticks. Passed asleep on the couch with his own blood streaming out of his veins after puncturing a blood vessel and painting a wall with his own. Number 8. By placing the muzzle beneath the chin, the man, who is about 40 years old, shoots his wife and children dead with a military rifle with a muzzle energy of about 3,000 joules. This path begins with a trail of blood that leads to a bathroom, a mirror, and then to an ammo box. A person was found dead on a bridge with a gunshot wound to the heart, but there was no weapon, bullet, or cartridge case to be recovered with the body. Finally, we had enough evidence to conclude that the man had committed suicide. Although we don't know how he managed to float the firearm. The bottom of the river was searched, and nothing was found except the tools of the bridge builders. Edit 1. I've noticed that many people are inspired by the second example, in which the weapon is made to vanish. Please rest assured that a wide range of scenarios were considered and addressed during the investigation. But the difficulty is, and this is where fact and fiction diverge, we must present facts backed up by proof. It's very possible that the pistol was stolen, but until we have concrete proof to support any of these theories, we can only go on supposition and assumption. Number 9. A friend of mine is a psychotherapist who used to work as a crime scene photographer in his former career. She went to a garage where a person had committed suicide. When this man chose to terminate his life, he wanted to go with the automobile, so he shut the garage door and turned on the engine before he left. To make matters worse, he'd taken a slew of painkillers and tranquilizers. As soon as I arrived, EMTs and other specialists were already searching for clues and other information about my friend's death. He was the VP of a fairly large chain of local businesses, so there was an insurance settlement to consider. Suddenly, the man who had been pronounced dead hours earlier started to shake fiercely while my friend was taking photos of the event. She kept shooting pictures because she feared it was a death rattle. EMTs were brought back in after the man gradually sat up and nodded, and they were able to stabilize him and save his life. He was pronounced dead at the scene because the automobile had run out of gas at the time he exited. He couldn't move or speak, but he had made it. Number 10. Here's a forensic scientist who gets called out to crime scenes from time to time to help with evidence collection. There was a father who shot his adult son and put the body in a deep freeze that he kept in his bedroom. Because I'd never been so close to a deceased person, Aside from funerals, I volunteered to assist the coroner remove the body from the freezer as soon as he asked for it, as I was fascinated about the process. There were still a lot of frozen biscuits sticking to his body when I helped the coroner remove the body from the freezer. It was strange and amusing at the same time that I had to remove them from his body. Number 11. I'm not a forensic scientist, but my mother was friends with a woman whose son killed himself in a horrific manner. A shotgun from the gun cabinet was taken to his room, where it was rigged to go off when the bedroom door was opened using string and pulleys. In the chair, he sat for what seemed like an eternity. Mom rushes to check on her son as soon as she arrives home from work. That woman was in need of a lot of help. I can't even fathom the sense of shame. Moreover, it was a shame that the boy had to rely on one of his parents to perform the dirty work for him. Number 12. The former coroner's acquaintance works at the hospital, and one day he says to come down and take a look. The coroner explained that the woman's death was caused by a shotgun blast, but it wasn't fire but bird shot from an estimated 50 feet away, and he instructed my mate to look for the pellet holes, so he did and found 3. When the coroner said "Good on you, well done," my mate looked around for a long time and eventually gave up, so the coroner told him to look at the back of his hand. He did so, and found the 4th and final pellet hole in her abdomen, which killed her because it entered her liver, per the coroner's instructions. Her middle finger had the final shotgun wound. She had been giving the individual who shot her the middle finger. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. Number 1. The mother was distraught and unsure of what to do when I arrived at her home after receiving a call about a missing child. Everyone was summoned to conduct a thorough search of the house and property. Due to the wide wooded area, I opted to investigate the rear. After a few minutes of searching, I spotted the youngster, who was tethered to an old chain link fence in the woods that was partially obscured by trees. To put it another way, he had practically been strangled to death by the fence since he must have fallen on top of it while trying to climb on it. The worst part was having to use the radio because I was afraid the mother would hear me because one of the other officers had a radio on. Number 2. It's preferable to accept the fact that you have no control over whether or not children come into contact with potentially lethal conditions. Even if you move to a first-floor flat and put your kids on cots in your room, they'll still have to spend 9 months of the year mingling with dozens of strangers during the daytime hours. There is a possibility that the first-floor apartment where you are house-schooling your children will catch fire. Aside from the inconvenience of having to leave your children alone while you go grocery shopping or risking their safety by taking them out into the wider world, even if you run 3 humidifiers per room around the clock, you'll still have to buy groceries. There is a chance that lightning could strike your apartment even if it is only you and your spouse, assuming you have one, or a trusted friend delivers your groceries. Furthermore, your children will be ill-prepared for college and the workforce if you follow through on all of these recommendations. Number 3. During my 3rd shift on Halloween night, I'm working near one of our smaller lakes, which is surrounded by some of the area's most expensive homes. All the streets in the area lead to a 2-lane road that skirts the lake's perimeter. As I approach the stop sign and begin to scan the road to my right in preparation for the turn, I notice something out of the corner of my eye in one of the many enormous trees that line the walkway around the lake. When I go back to check what it was, I find a man who has been left hanging. Because the neighborhood goes all out for every holiday's decorations, I initially assumed it was a Halloween decoration. But when my flashlight hits him, I realize it wasn't a decoration at all. He's dead. A group of trick-or-treaters comes down the street just as I'm getting ready to call it in. They see my car and begin to run toward me, so I make a beeline for the parent walking with them, telling her that she needs to take the longer route around the block. She can see it on my face, I'm not kidding. As it turned out, the young man was a heartbroken 20-year-old whose fiancée had dumped him, and he had been living in the final house on that block, where she would see him the next morning when she peered out her window. Number 4. One of the back doors had been left open when we responded to a burglary alarm at a mortuary. In order to verify that the alarm was unfounded, it is now standard procedure to examine the whole building, which most are. It's nighttime, and it's completely dark. As a rule, We don't switch on the lights. We enter a room and see a dead body on a table. The mortician appeared to be working on it, perhaps embalming it. Mild decomposition may be detected in the air. Nothing unusual is found when I shine a flashlight at a shadow on the right side of the room. I quickly detect a strong perfume scent passing past. When the search was finally finished, it was done more quickly than usual, but nothing was found. Number 5. My great-uncle was a sergeant and had to respond to a complaint of domestic violence multiple times while he was on duty. This elder gentleman had a younger man who was only 18 years old, and he would pay the younger man to swallow various stuff like paper clips and human hair for him. The younger person would dump it out into a bag, and the elder person would search through the feces like it was some kind of goddamn treasure hunt to find the goods. After that, he would place each one in an own envelope before filing it. Edit: the poop treasure hunt has nothing to do with the domestic abuse that was going on. My opinion is that it is not against the law, yet, it is really creepy. Number 6. I was dispatched to a report of an infant who was unresponsive. When I arrived, the entire family was gathered in the front yard, and they were all standing about chatting while pointing into the home. I went to the back of the house and discovered the infant lying on her back on an empty mattress. I began performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but quickly realized that it was probably too late for the infant. We hurried her to the waiting ambulance in the hopes that the medical professionals there may find a way to bring her back. After discovering that she was the mother's second kid to die under questionable circumstances from SIDS, I took the other children away from her care. The most challenging aspect of the issue was when I had to leave it and go to the emergency room to find out what had happened. As I entered the building and inquired about her location, a nurse in the emergency room approached me, handed me the lifeless infant who was wrapped in a blanket, and instructed me to wait until someone showed me the way to the mortuary. When I was standing there in the emergency room wearing my uniform and holding what everyone thought was a living infant, but was actually a dead infant, several people stopped by wanting to see her and making comments about how cute it was to see an officer holding a baby. I merely smiled, but it killed me inside. After what seemed like a lifetime, I was led back to the morgue, and I was informed that I would need to remain there with the infant until the medical examiner arrived. They removed the coverings from her, then placed her on a gurney made of stainless steel, and then they left me alone with her once more. About an hour was spent passing the time while I loitered around the morgue. Because this call came in 15 minutes before the conclusion of my 10-hour work, when I finally went home several hours after the end of my shift, I laid down on my bed and sobbed for a considerable amount of time. While I was at work, my wife looked after our small daughter while she was at daycare. Because I felt an urgent need to cuddle up with both of them, the house appeared to be devoid of any life. When I was looking at the baby earlier, I kept imagining my own daughter, who was just a little bit older than the infant. My daughter was only a little bit older than the child. In the hours leading up to my return to work for the following shift later that night, I was unable to get any sleep at all. Number 7. Received a call informing me that someone wasn't picking up their phone or answering their doorbell. As soon as we arrived at the house, we observed that every window had either curtains or pieces of paper covering them to block out the light. We shouted through the letterbox and rang the doorbell, but there was no one present to answer the door. After opening the door, we proceeded to enter the building. It appeared as though someone had just finished eating inside the house. Bread was present on the table, and either fruit juice or milk was contained in the glasses. Toys for children were strewn almost everywhere. Then I came across a note that sent shivers down my spine. It was a message expressing a desire to end one's life. The fact that the door could only be opened from the inside meant that the person had to be inside the home. We went room by room checking, and when I got to the restroom, my heart rate shot up to 350%. I cautiously opened the door, expecting to find bloody wrists or a slashed throat, but there was nothing there. At long last, there was only one more place to go, and that was the attic. We took our time climbing the steps, and when we reached the top, there was a resident dangling from a beam. The rush of adrenaline I had, the drama that unfolded in the living room, and the resident I tracked down are things I will never forget. Number 8. Because my husband's father is seated next to me, I decided to ask him. He is a former deputy sheriff and sheriff who has since retired. He was the first person to arrive at the scene of an accident. A vehicle loaded with people who worked on farms was making its way back from the fields. A young girl who was riding in the back of the truck was thrown out when it ran over a bump in the road during an intersection, and she landed on the ground with her head first. My mill was the one who held her while she wailed in pain and eventually passed away in his arms. He claims that even after all these years, he can occasionally replay her voice in his head. Number 9. On the evening of Valentine's Day, my cousin, who also happens to be a police officer, responded to a call. A child who was 12 years old called the station to report that her mother had committed suicide by shooting herself in the head in the living room. It seems as though she and her brother were getting ready for dinner when their mother decided to shoot herself. He stated that the most unsettling aspect of it was the fact that supper was all set up, and beverages were already on the table, and then she abruptly shot herself. When he arrived, the children were sitting outdoors, and I still find it difficult to picture what Valentine's Day is like for them. However, I am certain that watching that was something that will stay with him forever. Number 10. In Texas, I work as a corrections officer, not as a police officer. One time, a guy cut the inside of his elbows along the side of his forearms, where it bends. He lay there in a large pool of his own blood as it began to pool around him. That day, I was one of the people who responded to the call. I'll never forget it. The odor was overwhelming the moment you stepped into the holding cell. Something that I had never noticed previously is that blood has a really strong smell of metal. Because he had been there for some time, the blood had begun to clot, which was another thing that I had not anticipated. As we pulled the barely conscious man out of the pool of blood, chunks of blood separated from his body in the same way that Jell-O does. It was quite unsettling for me because I had no idea any of it was going to happen, and I was unable to psychologically prepare myself for it. Due to the fact that we do not have any actual medical training, the whole thing came as a great shock to me. Number 11. Although I am not a law enforcement officer myself, my father is, and I once questioned him about this. He said to me that it happened at this one house when he went there because a woman had called him and informed him that males were breaking into the house. When he arrived, he reported that it was instantly extremely obvious that the woman's mental state was not precisely where it should have been. He claimed that she was always murmuring things and that she was quite jumpy and jittery. In addition to this, he claimed that every single wall in her home had at least 6 or 7 crosses on it, and possibly even more. After he has succeeded in calming her down, he looks around the house for any traces of entrance or merely anything strange, but he finds absolutely nothing that would indicate that someone had been successful in breaking into the house or had been attempting to do so. He claimed that she followed him throughout the entire time and would point to various objects, such as doorknobs or window locks, and remark things about them. "Oh no, I can't believe you found that there." That is how they were able to gain access. It was very spooky, according to him, considering that he was in this woman's house in the middle of the night, surrounded by crosses, and listening to her babble on about random shit. He stated that the whole situation was fairly eerie. To make her feel better, he checked the entire house to see if there was anyone else there, but he came to the conclusion that there was no one else there. He mentioned that the one thing that gave him the creeps was the fact that she would say things like, "Oh, they're here again," or "He's right behind us, I can feel it," every few minutes. He found this to be very unsettling. Number 12. I worked at an agency that was in charge of performing computer forensics investigations and was part of a high-tech task force. A significant amount of child sex. Lots. Anyway, we were conducting a search warrant sweep involving multiple agencies in a major metropolitan region in the state of California. When we went to serve a search warrant at a property in a nice neighborhood for distributing or having CP, we saw that the suspect had the appearance of a typical child molester from Hollywood movies. He and his crippled wife lived together, without any children, and she had mobility concerns, mostly stayed downstairs, and had not been upstairs for years. We proceed upstairs, and when we get there, we find that this man has a genuine masturbation station set up in one of the bedrooms, and he has a padlock on the door leading to it. It was dark, the windows were closed, and he had baby dolls all throughout the room with their assholes cut out and some of their mouths cut out so that they could be used as an impromptu baby sex doll. A few of the heads were removed, and they were placed in various locations throughout the floor. This individual had some significant problems. Number 13. My cousin was the one who received the phone call late one night informing him that two young brothers, aged 4 and 6, had been discovered dead in an almost empty swimming pool. The water level in the pool was somewhere between 6 and 8 inches when their father gave them a call. Although they were never able to bring charges against the man, the general consensus is that he was responsible for the deaths of his two boys. Number 14. Received a call to help an ambulance at a location because the crew was having difficulty dealing with a woman who appeared to be having a seizure. As soon as we arrived, we saw that she was a frail-looking Singaporean woman who was being restrained on the ground by an emergency medical technician. The paramedic reports that she is hissing, straining against her, and making many attempts to bite her. There is no white in either of her dark and crimson eyes. To hold her down, 200 pounds, my partner for the evening, about 180 pounds, and 3 paramedics are required. The entire time, she is struggling and attempting to bite despite having veins protruding out of her neck. She is yelling at something that she cannot see in the far corner of the room, pleading with it not to murder her and the rest of us. She is looking past us in our direction. Her husband, who is strangely unconcerned by the whole situation, claims that she has been experiencing these symptoms ever since the time that she traveled to Singapore and became ill after visiting a place of worship there. The only way to stop it in the past has been for her sister to rub this powder on her forehead in the shape of a cross, but she is currently out of the country. In the end, she was evaluated for her mental health in a hospital after the paramedics transported her there. I frequently wonder how things turned out, but sadly I have no way of finding out what happened. Number 19. For some reason, the deaths by suicide have always had the greatest impact on me. Because I went through high school with a good friend who later committed suicide, the topic of suicide is very sensitive for me, as it is for most people, but especially for those who have had personal experience with it. I've witnessed 5 people take their own lives, 3 by shooting themselves, 2 by hanging themselves, and a few more purposely taking their own lives through the use of drugs or other means. To make a long story short, a man shot himself in the head with a .357 Magnum in his garage. Even though I have a really strong stomach, which is a blessing because experience has helped me build it up, I think I may have accidentally stomped on a portion of his eye. As soon as I was finished with the call, I walked straight to the locker room and spent the next half an hour cleaning the mud off the bottom of my boots. I went through the same cleaning routine at my house as well. That is, without a doubt, not what one would call creepy, yet it is unsettling all the same. However, consider this one. We receive a call from the hotel off the highway informing us that employees went to clean a room and discovered a message taped to the door of the bathroom, which was closed and locked. It said there, "Please do not enter. Call 911. So the front desk carried out the aforementioned action. Once we get there, she shows us the room, and then we attempt to knock on the door of the bathroom. No answer. We weren't even sure if there was someone in there, but the manager who was on site assured us that we were permitted to push our way into the restroom. She was concerned since none of the staff could recall ever seeing the customer check out. When my partner finally managed to open the door, what we saw inside was straight out of a horror movie. A man was observed bathing in the water while entirely naked. There is a knife on the floor, just close to the bathroom sink. Cuts on his wrists, and the blood within the bathtub was easily the most upsetting aspect of the situation. In the more than 10 years that I've been in this line of work, I've never seen so much blood. It appeared as though he was frowning and his face was a pale white color. It didn't look like he was breathing at all. Call a medic, my partner says. I just stare at him and reply, no. Dude's dead. I'm not touching him, and you may check on him if you want to, but our supervisor, an EVT, and a detective need to come check out this situation. I was able to identify a deceased person whenever I came across one. I get the manager, who is actually having a panic attack at this point, to settle down and return to the desk so that we can deal with this situation. As soon as I heard my colleague gasp and shout, "Oh fucky shit," I dialed the number for another car and instructed dispatch to contact our evidence technicians as well as a detective. I quickly make my way back over there, and when I do, I find him staring with wide eyes at the body. It looks like he just relocated. That jerk is still breathing, man. He made a move. What exactly are you going on about? He fucking has a pulse on that thing. When I tried to check for it, his leg moved under the water, which indicates that he has it even if it is quite feeble. When I finally got around to putting on my big boy underwear, I discovered that I could hardly detect a pulse on this man. He was taken to the emergency room as soon as the ambulance arrived. It turned out that he made the cutting only a few minutes before the cleaning woman found the message, thus it is surprising that he managed to survive at all. To clarify, I'm editing this sentence to say that I need to remind myself not to submit lengthy comments while I'm on my mobile device. He managed to survive, but it wasn't a pleasant fight. He cut his wrists as he was taking a shower. The majority of what appeared to be blood was actually blood, but it was mixed in with water, so it gave the appearance that there was much more blood than there actually was. He actually only spilled a small amount of blood. And to tell you the truth, slashing your wrists is not the best method for ending your own life. He believes that he was bleeding for approximately 10 to 15 minutes before he started to go to sleep, and he would have been alright for a little bit longer as long as he got care as soon as he could have gotten it. It is contingent on a great number of other aspects of the situation. I am aware that I ought to have been more vigilant in looking for any indications of life, but I did not. My failure to check more frequently was negligent on my part. However, this one really fooled us, and as a result, we were able to get valuable insight from the experience. In most situations, it is very simple to identify a dead body when you have one. Thankfully, while I was gone, my companion did, despite the fact that I had no intention of preventing him from carrying out the action. My tone was noticeably more jaded than usual. He looks dead. I do not believe that a medical professional is required of us. You are free to check him, but I have no desire to do so. To be fair to us, it seemed as though he was completely lifeless when we found him. He had no chest movement at all, his skin was pale, and it appeared as though he had been there for at least a few hours. However, as I've already mentioned, I readily admit that I was in the wrong. Due to the fact that I am still relatively new to the industry, this was a learning lesson for me. There are times when you forget that your experience and training is not objective. You can know that from that point on, both of us exercised increased vigilance. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. Number 1. We recently relocated to a new home. The renter who was living in the house died unexpectedly of natural causes in his mid-40s while we were in the process of purchasing it. He died in the center of the living room. We moved in shortly after, and our 2-year-old daughter began talking about the ghost who resides in our house almost immediately. Let's be honest, she's 2, and 2-year-olds are quite impressionable. Halloween had just gone, and she had this Halloween-themed picture book that she loved to read, so it's completely plausible that all of her mention about ghosts sprang from her regular perusal of that book. Even so, she was always telling me that the ghost was in her basement playhouse, or that the ghost was on the stairs, or that the ghost was standing in the corner. She didn't seem to be terrified of the ghost and considered him a friend, so I wasn't worried even if there was a ghost haunting our house. It might be a lot worse if he's a pleasant and helpful ghost. I used to tell the ghost that he could stay if he wanted to, but he could also leave if that made him happier. I was about 30-70 on the ghost being genuine and she being able to see and communicate with him versus the ghost being a figment of her imagination inspired by her Halloween book. Until one morning when we were getting ready to leave for daycare. It was still dark and raining outside. My daughter informed me that the ghost was on the back deck, and that it was the ghost's birthday, and that she wanted to wish him a happy birthday. I basically ignored what she was saying because she is birthday crazy and has previously forced us to sing happy birthday to Mickey Mouse, a bowl of fruit snacks, and the lavatory. So we said happy birthday to the ghost and went about our business. I searched up the obituary of the man who had died in our house later that day out of pure curiosity. And what do you know? It was his actual birthday. Number 2. My room is located on the second story of the house. There is no patio/porch/overhang beneath my windows. I was watching TV in bed around 2 a.m. a few years back when I heard a louder than usual beast sound. It's not uncommon to hear squirrels running around on the roof on occasion. I didn't give it much thought. This kept happening, and it began to sound very near to the window rather than on the roof. For a long time, I ignored it. After at least 40 to 45 minutes of being upset by the noise, best guess, I had watched a few of South Park episodes on my DVR during that time. I hammered on the wall in the hopes of scaring them away until I could sleep. My fist made 2 rapid bangs, which were met with 2 bangs on the wall beside the window from outside. Needless to say, I nearly puked and bolted out of bed. My living room now has a bay window and is located on the opposite end of the home, so I could look out that window from the side and see my bedroom window. I dashed downstairs to take a look. A man is standing in front of my house, just below my bedroom window. He's holding a knife, a little pocket knife, and petting the front of my house. Call the cops and sit tight. He never leaves the front of the house, even when they roll up and quickly disarm and capture him. Number 3. I was about 19 years old, living with a roommate and attending college while living in an apartment complex. I suffer moderate attacks of sleeplessness on occasion, but nothing significant, generally just a 2 or 3 hour delay in going to bed. I suddenly can't sleep one night. Nothing works to soothe me, and I soon give up and simply stay in the front room all night, playing heavy rain that had just fallen a few days before. I received a text from my roommate the next day, as I was leaving for work fatigued after only a few hours of sleep. Dude, the cops are stationed throughout the residential complex. Apparently, 9 flats, including our downstairs neighbor, were broken into while people were sleeping at home last night. Some folks even claimed having items stolen from their sleeping quarters. It dawned on me that if I hadn't stayed up all night and left the front room light on, I would have been robbed or worse. I did not attend college in an apartment complex. Number 4. It was winter break during my first year of college. I drove up to northwestern Pennsylvania to see one of my pals for New Year's. I wanted to be back home for work the next day, so I opted to drive back around 2 a.m. I was traveling along Interstate 79. For anyone reading from Pennsylvania, this event took place around Grove City, and only encountered 2 cars in 60 miles. I came around a corner and saw what appeared to be a black bear in my lane, so I swerved and smashed into the forest line adjacent to the highway. I was in the middle of nowhere, and the bear simply walked into the trees. My car was totaled, and I knew I wouldn't see any automobiles for hours to get me out. I called 911, and they said they'd be there in about 20 minutes. I stepped out of the car and stood on the highway shoulder, waiting. I heard some stirring in the bushes after about 5 minutes, and there it was, the fucking bear. When I skidded off the road, I hit a cub, and Mama Bear was furious as hell. I made my way to the back of the car and climbed into the trunk. Thank goodness I had a large Ford Expedition to keep the bear at bay. For the next half hour, the bear tried bashing the car and lunging at me in a rage. When the cops arrived, the sirens terrified Mama Bear back into the woods. It was the most horrifying event I'd ever had. Edit. Holy shit, a lot of you are from Pennsylvania, and I'm astonished how many of you live near where this happened. Number 5. I've already posted this, but it's one of my family's favorite stories. My uncle contacted my mother one morning and said, "My 4 tiny cousins never met my grandfather because he died before they were born. They went downstairs for breakfast as usual one morning. While my uncle was preparing their dinner, one of them pointed to the fridge and remarked, 'That's him.' My uncle, unconcerned, asked, 'Who?' and looked over. They were pointing to a photograph of my grandfather, whom they had never met. The man who comes and talks to us at night till we fall asleep occasionally," said my cousin. It's not terrifying, but it's unsettling. Number 6. I've mentioned this earlier in a related discussion. For context, this occurred a few months ago. My husband and I, like other couples, have a designated side of the bed. I sleep on the right side, and he sleeps on the left. My preferred sleeping posture is to lie on my left side, away from him, and face the window. He switches between facing the bathroom door and me. I was fighting sleep one night a few weeks ago. I'm laying on my left side as usual, but I can't seem to get comfortable. My neck hurts from laying on my left, so I roll over and face my husband. When I roll over, I see not only my husband's back, but also a big shadow standing over him. Immediately, the shadow reaches out to me and speaks with me to turn over. I recall thinking its face was distorted in some way, indicating malice, but I can't remember what it looked like. Although I did not hear a voice, the communication was urgent and aggressive. It seemed to want to hurt me. I turn around without thinking and shortly fall asleep. To be honest, I'm not sure if I was dreaming or not. My spouse and I get up about the same time the next morning and go about our usual routine. I don't say anything because my hubby dislikes discussing spiritual matters, which I felt it was. However, this morning is unusual, and he appears to be uneasy. He finally admits to having a horrible nightmare after much prodding. He had a dream that a demon was trying to make him do things while he was asleep, very horrible shit. He didn't elaborate, and when he woke up, the monster attacked him. I didn't tell my spouse that I had a similar dream, but I wasn't sure if I was awake or asleep. While sleeping, I turned over to face my spouse, which I never do. A demon shadow appeared in my face and told me to turn around, which I did. The next morning, he had the same dream, except the demon told him to hurt/attack me. Okay, here are some of the often asked questions, notably about the sleeping posture. I'm trying to explain it as best I can because I'm at work and can't create a picture. When you enter the room, you will notice the bed against the wall, facing the entrance. The bathroom entrance is on the left side of the room, while the window is on the right, from your perspective. You walk up to the foot of the bed and stand over us sleeping. My husband is sleeping on his right side, facing the bathroom, while I am sleeping on my left side, facing the window. When I allude to my right and left, I'm speaking from my own point of view. I apologize if this caused any confusion. Another point. I turn around without thinking and shortly fall asleep. Someone said that I should have saved my husband. When this happened, I honestly thought I was dreaming. I saw the shadow, but it was so bizarre that I assumed it didn't exist. Furthermore, I don't recall seeing its face, only the angry presence. And I fell back asleep so easily, which I never do when I open my eyes and look about. I don't recall flipping over deliberately, it was automatic. So, of course, I didn't just leave my husband to fend for himself. If I thought it was real, I would have screamed or woken him up, which may or may not have had bad consequences. Any more thoughts on sleep paralysis? Okay, maybe. I've never experienced anything like this before. Perhaps it was a strange confluence of SP on my part and a bad nightmare on my husband's. Maybe we're that emotionally connected. This was a scary one-time occurrence in my life. It did make me feel uneasy and apprehensive for a few days thereafter. I didn't sleep well for a few nights after that, but when it didn't return, I dismissed it. My husband and I never discussed it again after that morning. To be honest, it appears that ignoring it will cause it to disappear. Thank you for believing me. Even if you don't believe me, hopefully that will help you sleep tonight. It's not something I want to go through again. Not only because of the terror, but also because of how I felt afterwards. Number 7. My office is in a small back hallway of one of the wings of the building that I work in, which is a rather small building with 3 wings. There is only one other person in the office but me, so it is typically very peaceful. One evening, she and I were the only people in our wing who were still there, and we both heard a door in the corridor slam shut violently. We were both feeling a little befuddled, and when I peered out the window, I didn't see anything out of the norm. During the next 2 weeks, I stayed particularly late at work to make up for lost time so that I could go on Christmas vacation. During that time, I started hearing faint noises in the corridor, even though I was certain that no one else was in the building. It sounded like somebody was slipping their shoe over the floor. This occurred on a few separate occasions. When the janitor and I were the only ones in the building earlier in the evening, she began to experience some very unsettling things. Even though everyone had exited the building, she claimed to have heard doors banging in one of the wings. During one of our investigations, we discovered that all of the doors were secured in the appropriate manner. However, I noted that the light in the kitchen was on, despite the fact that the door was secured. The janitor became really distressed when she realized that she had switched off the light before shutting the door. I also remembered that there were a handful of evenings when I was the only one there, yet the light was still on. I started asking around to see if other people in the building had seen anything strange like that, and one lady told me that some of the decor in her room would move whenever she returned from the restroom. And this next one is the one that gives me the creeps. Another lady told me that one day she discovered a footprint in the middle of her desk. It's the black material that reveals skin prints very well. To tell you the truth, the thought that there is a person behind all of this gives me the chills. Because of this, I would much rather it be paranormal stuff. Number 8. A number of years ago, I was a resident of an apartment. There are 4 apartments on each floor of the building. I occupied the apartment on the second floor, while the one on the first floor was always unoccupied. I knew I shouldn't have been alarmed when I continued to hear footsteps moving through the flat. There was no one downstairs. I wanted to check my sanity, so I got a friend to come over and listen to what was going on. Since the downstairs is vacant, it's possible that I'm only hearing sounds from neighboring apartments since everything is echoing. Wrong. I couldn't help but keep hearing the footsteps. This continued for the better part of an hour. In the end, I contacted both the landlord and the authorities. It appeared as though someone had broken into the flat through the windows in the basement, and they were carrying a knife as they moved throughout the space. Number 9. On one Halloween, 2 different groups of people from the neighborhood engaged in a battle with eggs. Nobody among us actively disliked the other, we were just in different cliques. As the opposing forces began to advance, we broke into a sprint in order to get away to a location where we were less in danger. As soon as we entered the forest, I made a hasty retreat behind a nearby tree, and everyone on the opposing side walked right by me. Or so I thought at the time. It would appear that Bill was struggling to free himself after becoming entangled in a branch. I emerged from hiding behind the tree to assist him because I could see that he was having a difficult time. As soon as I came close to him, he looked up, and we immediately locked eyes. He exhibited a genuine expression of fright in his eyes. I asked him if he wanted some assistance, and he mumbled very softly, "Yes." "Fine." After that, we were able to set him free, and I raced off to rejoin the battle. Someone approached me the following day at school with the question, "Is what Bill stated true?" I responded with a snide yup, and then I left the room. After that, it occurred for the second, third, and fourth time respectively. I always replied with yup to their questions. I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't curious about what they were talking about, but since everyone posed the question in the same way, I just pretended like I didn't care and played along. As if they have just realized that ghosts are real and have always been there. During lunch, I overhear someone remark to Bill, "Hey, Bill. I want to ask you something." He mutters, "Yes, what?" in a low voice. My response is always the same, "Why does everyone keep asking me if what you stated is true?" He stated, to put it simply, "It was the strangest thing. You weren't there." Suddenly, I find myself staring straight at you in front of me. You suddenly materialized before my very eyes. I'm sure there's a reason behind it, but buddy, you weren't there, so I can't tell you. I am quite aware that you were not. I chuckled and told him that I had been hiding behind the tree and that I had just come out to aid him since I saw that he was in trouble. He calms himself by putting his hand on my shoulder and exhaling deeply before continuing. He said, "Jesus Christ, I was petrified. I thought I was going to die. I've been sharing my tale with others to find out if anyone else has had a similar experience with you. During that time, I had the ability to vanish and reappear at will." Number 10. When I was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, I was staying in a house that was located on the outskirts of the main city, way back on a dirt road in Farmville. During that time, I was there for a brief period of time. I used to constantly scare myself out due to the age of the house, the location, and the fact that the only other people that lived there with me were 2 cats. The house is over 200 years old. Anyways, on one of the coldest nights in January, -15 degrees Fahrenheit, I was awakened between 2:30 and 3 a.m. to the sound of someone urgently ringing my doorbell. I inched my way cautiously toward the entrance, hoping to catch a peek of my unannounced visitors before they realized I could see them. I was startled when all of a sudden I heard them thumping on the wooden wrap-around deck leading up to the front door, and making their way to the large glass side door. I thought I heard a murmur or a moan. It seemed like someone was rattling the door knob. At this point, I am preparing to phone the authorities while simultaneously hiding in my room with my gun drawn. I could hear and see the shadows of people outside each window, trying each one to see whether it slid open while it took the police 25 minutes to make their way up there to investigate. During that time, the police were investigating the situation. When the police arrived, they walked around the house and found only one set of footprints in the snow. And one set of drag marks. Additionally, they were able to determine where and when the person who was being dragged was seated down in the snow at various entry points while the other guy was checking for a way in. Moved shortly after, not because of the failed attempt to enter, but rather because Fort Wayne, Indiana is an awful place to call home. Number 11. One that I published about a year ago and it could use a little sprucing up. I was working as a guide and administrator at a historical jail, that's a prison museum for those of you in the United States, quite a few years ago now. Working at this location was never a comfortable experience due to the fact that it was one of the oldest buildings in the city and had a strong reputation among those who investigate paranormal activity. There were a lot of ghost stories because the early days had been rather violent and there had been a few deaths, including state-ordered hangings, so there had been a lot of deaths. Because the building was so old, a shelter for the local fauna, and not at all resistant to wind, any stories had to be taken with a grain of salt, despite the fact that I did witness some pretty strange occurrences during my time there. We also had several dozen mannequins arranged in what we called typical stances. Some of them were displayed in the courtyard, while others were hidden away in the cells. It was always entertaining to listen to the tourists' shocked reactions when they saw the first one standing in the corridor. The narrative will now begin. It was possible for me to go hours without encountering another person during the winter months in this predominantly tourist town because it was really quiet. One day, I lucked out and was able to acquire a late closure one night and an early morning opening the following day. Both of these openings had been difficult to come by. Due to the time of year, it being completely dark and the fact that lights were not installed throughout the entire complex, a torch was required for both closing and opening the facility. Because I had just one visitor the entire day, I was becoming bored, so I decided to take one of the surplus mannequins from the storeroom, dress it up in some early convict female costume, and place it in the kitchen of the ladies' wing of the prison. I came to the conclusion that the best way to position them would be with their backs to the door while I held a bowl in one hand and an egg beater in the other. After ensuring that everything was in excellent condition, I locked up the kitchen for the evening. The following day, I arrived at the complex at 6 in the morning to open up, and as I was making my way through the building, I noticed an odd sound. The room I was in shared a wall with the kitchen's, and as I stood there in the dark listening to it, I could hear a weird scraping noise coming from the kitchen's side of the wall. As I listened, the noise stopped, started again, and then became more intense while also making a tapping noise. I proceeded around the building, which was arranged in a circular fashion with rooms on the interior, and made my way slowly towards the kitchens, all the while feeling a little uneasy about the situation. I was standing outside the door when I first became aware of the strange noise. It was loud enough that I made the decision to use the sliding hatch on the door in order to peer inside the room. There was motion in the mannequin. Not merely shifting slightly, but clearly tapping one foot up and down while it gently cranked the egg beater, with its arm raising and lowering as it did so. My brain started to process what I was seeing as soon as my eyes become used to the darkness. Whether it was possession or a poltergeist, I was not going to wait around for this thing to come around. Instead, I slammed that hatch closed and hightailed it back the way I came, not pausing until I reached the main office, where I swiftly bolted the door and switched on every light I could find. Around 10 in the morning, we welcomed our first customer in the form of a tourist. At this point, I had successfully persuaded myself that what I had witnessed was in all likelihood a hallucination of some kind. Because it was so dark, I must have imagined the rest of what happened after hearing the structure shift slightly. I was aware that I would need to let the tourist to pass through the kitchen, so I affixed a note that read return in 5 minutes to the front desk and then silently made my way towards the kitchen door. I opened the hatch in a cautious manner and peeked inside, where I saw the mannequin still standing in the same posture that I had left it in, without moving. I let out a very loud sigh of relief as I realized that everything was back to normal, and then I opened the door. As soon as I walked through the door, the mannequin started rapidly tapping its foot while using the egg beater to mix the ingredients. It was full daylight, and I couldn't convince myself that nothing was happening this time, even though it was occurring right in front of me. That was the moment when I was more afraid than I had ever been before or since. What the hell was I meant to do when I found myself trapped in a jail cell with a possessed mannequin and the only person in a position of power when an innocent member of the public was about to enter this same room? I can clearly recall thinking that plaster and paper mache are the sole materials used. Simply kill it. Destroy it as soon as possible, then get the hell away from there and don't look back. I cautiously approached the object while holding a meat mallet in my hand and moving forward with much reluctance. As I drew closer, it started moving more quickly, and by the time I was almost there, it was already out of reach. When I grabbed hold of the mannequin's arm, I was fully prepared for it to spin around and bury the egg beater in my chest. However, instead of that happening, the mannequin let out a horrible, croaking hissing noise. At this point, I was on the verge of throwing up, but the hissing felt surprisingly familiar to me for some reason. After gathering myself, I peeked into the bowl that the mannequin was using its other arm to hold in its other arm. A king skink of around 40 centimeters in length was peering up at me while its head was firmly wedged between the beaters. The skink started to flee as soon as I removed my hand from the arm of the mannequin. Because it was unable to move, it continued to run in circles at the bottom of the bowl. This caused the beater that was attached to the mannequin's arm to turn, which then caused the arm to move up and down, causing the entire thing to vibrate and cause the mannequin's foot to tap against the ground. 5 minutes later, I was letting the poor guy go in the courtyard as I was still giggling uncontrollably to myself, and by the end of that day, that mannequin was packed up and put back in storage. Just in case. Number 12. My granddad is the one who originally told me this story. A little bit of history first. All of this goes down in West Virginia in the 1920s. My great-grandpa is the 9th and youngest child in a family that has never been beyond the poverty line. They are all crammed into a single room in the house. My grandpa's sister became ill out of the blue and went into a coma not long after that. They say she had a fever and that she would shake and sometimes sit up in the middle of the night even though she was not conscious of what was going on around her. She continued to deteriorate over the next few days, reaching a point where she required assistance of some kind. My grandpa and his oldest sister, Glenna, remained at home while the rest of the family traveled the 10 miles down the road to the neighbor's house in order to obtain some food and medicine. When the family finally arrived home that evening, their mother went straight to their sister's room and began applying a cold compress to her head using a cloth. As soon as her eyes opened, which had been the first time in days, she stared her mother dead in the eyes and stated, "The Lord wants Glenna." She went back into unconsciousness after falling to the ground and jerking briefly. Both Glenna and her sister had passed away by the following morning. The illness took the life of the younger sister, and the circumstances behind Glenna's death are unknown. Number 13. In the year 1993, my family and I made our home in a quaint community in the state of Washington known as Ritzville. When it happened, I was only 5 years old, but the events that transpired have caused me to ruminate on them almost every single night for the past 22 years. My younger brother and I slept in a bunk bed together in the same room. A modest closet with a decent amount of depth was situated a few feet away from the foot of the bunk bed in this room. There was a small vent on the wall, and at night, when the light in the living room was turned on, the light would shine through it and into my room, giving it a soft, warm warmth. Then, there was this one night when I woke up with the need to use the restroom, and as I sat up in bed to remove the covers, I observed that at the foot of the bunk bed was this tall black figure with a gigantic oval head that covered the width of the bunk bed and was staring at me. I was terrified. I estimated that it stood somewhere between 5 and 6 feet tall and saw that it had two little yellow eyes set quite far apart from one another. Its skin had a charcoal color and a bumpy texture. After staring at it for a good 5 seconds, I quickly put the blankets over my head and went back to sleep. I'm going to need more than 5 seconds to get this monster out of my head. I was acutely aware of the malevolence that pervaded the area. Since I was awake for a bit and then went back to sleep, I can't say how long I was there because I fell asleep again. When I opened my eyes in the morning, the first thing I saw was the door to the closet. I always make it a point to shut the closet doors before going to bed, but last night one of them was wide open. My mother was the first person to find out about it, and you know how most parents dismiss the experiences of their children as nothing more than a nightmare? She didn't. She was aware that I had seen something because they themselves had seen stuff. I had nightmares for weeks after seeing that. In my nightmares, this monster grabbed me and immediately began tormenting me. Since then, I haven't seen it, and I have no intention of ever doing so again. It had been Bill's, her late husband's, belonging all along. Bill's voice had pleaded with her to open the door to the closet, telling her that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven where they could be together again, and young, like they had been when they had first met, for all of eternity. Bill had said that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven because God wanted them to be together forever. At this moment, Jerry was sitting on the opposite side of the couch from me, and he gazed at me with wide eyes. And after that, what took place? I nudged her in a kind manner. Mrs. Garrity said, "At first I believed I was dreaming. At first, I believed it must have been a dream. It had been 3 years since poor Bill had been seen. And given that I was in the midst of a dream, I didn't think it would be a problem to comply with what he was requesting of me. I sprang out of bed and made my way to the storage cupboard. I put my hand on the lock, but I pulled back before I could turn it. There was an unsettling feeling that things wasn't quite right. It was Bill's voice, and while it appeared to be entirely normal, it was also in some strange way incorrect. It wasn't at all like Bill used to talk in the way that he was doing it at all. It was as if an unknown person was speaking to me in Bill's voice in an attempt to deceive me into opening that closet door. That doesn't make much sense, does it? However, despite the fact that nothing she was saying made any sense to us, we persisted in asking her to continue narrating her narrative. Bill, or whoever or whatever was using his voice, had kept pleading with her to unlock the closet even after she had done so. The tone of the voice had become hostile and threatening when she had refused, and it had changed as well. It had first demanded angrily that she open the door, and when she continued to refuse, it had started shouting at her, using profanity, and making vulgar threats, things Bill never would have said to me when he was alive, before proceeding to pound violently on the door. The voice had begun to alter, and it was no longer reminiscent of the one that belonged to her late spouse. It had deepened and warped to the point where it didn't sound human anymore. She had been so terrified that she had run out of her bedroom and spent the night on the couch in the living room. After some time had passed, both the hammering and the threats ceased. At this moment, Jerry interrupts Mrs. Garrity in a manner that is polite and asks, "Mrs. Garrity, why didn't you call us at the police station when this happened?" She was silent for a brief period of time, and then a frown creased the corners of her mouth before she smiled. She revealed this information to us and said, "I assumed you'd think I was just imagining it. I am aware that the citizens of this town believe that I am an insane old lady. And I've brought you all out here so many times in the past for things that turned out to be completely unimportant. I didn't want to worry you about it since I thought maybe it was all in my brain." After that point, the situation had worsened really rapidly. The constant hammering and threats had been going on night after night. Because she was so terrified, she had began sleeping on the couch in the living room rather than in her own bedroom. Then, one night, the pounding had began, and it had not just been on the door to her bedroom closet, rather, it had begun simultaneously on all of the closet doors in the home. She explained to us that it sounded like there were individuals in all of them wanting to get out at the same time, but that we were hearing the same voice in each closet. It was the same dreadful voice. She was so terrified that she had fastened all of the closet doors shut in order to prevent the monster, whatever it was, from escaping and coming after her. After that, around 2 weeks ago, something that was much more horrifying had taken place. After a moment, she emerged from the bathroom, where she had been washing her hands in the sink. When she had gazed into the mirror on the top of the medicine cabinet, she halted her speech here. Jerry questioned her by asking, "What did you see?" Whimpering through her clenched teeth, she managed to get out, "I saw it. Instead of seeing my own face, I saw its face." It was dressed in a long, dark robe with a hood over its head, and instead of a face, it had the appearance of a smirking skull. A horned skull or a horned skull. The color of its eyes was crimson. Those of the devil himself, in his own eyes. When I say that I saw it standing behind me in the mirror, what I really mean is that I saw it in the mirror itself. A chill ran up my spine at the thought of it. It tried to grab me after reaching out of the mirror with what appeared to be claws because it didn't have any hands. She had shattered the glass of the mirror in her panic by hurling a bottle of lotion at it, and then, out of an abundance of caution, she had done the same thing to all of the other mirrors in the home. How in the world were you able to continue living in this place with everything that was going on? I asked her. She gave a pitiful shrug. There is nowhere else for me to go, and no one who is willing to take me in. The nights were horrible, but the days were invariably far better than the nights. At least I would be able to get some sleep after that. It never continued beyond the morning hours, and it never occurred during the day. She trembled all of a sudden. Up until the past 3 days, after that, it became something that occurred frequently. The day and the night, no matter what hour it was, I was never in a safe environment. Late this morning was when everything finally came to a head. The pounding had been going on for some time, but it had recently become much more intense and strong, to the point where all of the closet doors were shaking in their frames. Even though the boards had been put over them, Mrs. Garrity was well aware that it was only a matter of time before whatever it was managed to break through. She had resorted to praying and reading from the Bible out of desperation, but all it did was make the entity that was hiding in the closet laugh sarcastically at her. At long last, she opened the door to the closet, pulled out Bill's shotgun, and fired it through the opening. She shared with us that for around 1 minute, there was complete silence. At first, I couldn't help but think that it was finally done. Then, I noticed those fiery red eyes glowing in the shadows. In the crater that was created by the shotgun. It made a chuckling sound, and it only spoke to me in one word. What word did it say? I asked her. She said the word tonight before her voice began to shake. She buried her face in her hands and started crying again as she bowed her head. Jerry and I were both trying to take in what she had just shared with us, so we were silent for a while. We exchanged looks, each of us clearly shaken by the events she had described. Of course, not one of us genuinely believed it, but it was clear that the poor woman was going through a lot of emotional turmoil. She was experiencing some kind of breakdown in her mental health. It's possible that her tenuous hold on reality eventually gave way, or that the effects of advancing age were beginning to show in her mental capacity. It was quite evident that she could no longer be left alone, since doing so put her in danger. Especially not in this location. It was not good for her health. For all we knew, her paranoid delusions could have been caused by a harmful type of mold that had grown inside the house. It was not a healthy environment for her. Jerry and I asked for a moment's break, and then we exited the building to have our conversation in private. We were both in agreement that she required assistance. It was necessary to put her in a mental hospital. But for the time being, it would be best if she stayed elsewhere. We turned around and went back inside, where we informed Mrs. Garrity that she would be accompanying us. It was planned that she would spend the night in a room at a motel in the city. And tomorrow, Jerry said, we were going to find a priest who would come and exorcise the evil spirit that had been bothering her, removing it once and for all. We were going to do this so that she would no longer have to worry about it. She sobbed again, this time with happiness in her eyes, and embraced both me and my boyfriend while again expressing her gratitude to us. After checking her into a low-cost motel in the city, we drove her there. Since she has been removed from that place for such a short period of time, it appears that her mental health has already begun to improve. She flashed us a grin and said that she couldn't wait to get a night of restful sleep without having to be concerned about whatever it was that was pounding on the doors during the night. I believe the primary emotion she was feeling was relief that she would no longer have to be terrified of the being that she was sure was hiding somewhere in her home. We both gave her a kind grin and waved goodbye before getting back into the cruiser and leaving. As soon as we moved away from the motel, the smiles on our faces began to vanish. Both of us kept our voices down as we drove. In spite of the fact that she had caused a nuisance for the police department on numerous occasions by making false calls and behaving in an unpredictable manner, we both liked old Mrs. Garrity. We were saddened to learn that her mental health had deteriorated to the point where she was unable to care for herself anymore. After we had returned, we related her account to the chief. He groaned with disappointment and nodded, indicating his agreement with the fact that she needed to be institutionalized somewhere. Tomorrow, he and I were going to get in the car and drive out to see her son and daughter in order to give them a personal explanation of what had been going on. And in the event that they continued to refuse to carry out the necessary actions, the chief would take it upon himself to ensure that Mrs. Garrity received the assistance she required. But that opportunity never presented itself to us. When Jerry and I dropped Mrs. Garrity off at the motel, that was the very last time any of us ever saw her. I received an urgent phone call from the chief at approximately 4 a.m. the next day, and he instructed me to report to the motel as soon as I was able to do so. On the other hand, I had a sneaking suspicion that it had something to do with Mrs. Garrity even if he wouldn't tell me why over the phone. As I was getting dressed, an overwhelming feeling of fear came over me. After we had left her at the motel, I couldn't help but wonder whether or not she had committed herself in her room. When I arrived at the motel, I found that the door to Mrs. Garrity's room had been blocked off with crime scene tape, which confirmed the worst of my suspicions. Outside, the chief, Jerry, Pete, and Vance, along with a couple of officers from the state police and 2 detectives from the city, were gathered. Also present were a few of state troopers. When I approached, the chief greeted me with a solemn expression on his face. He told Mrs. Garrity that she was no longer there. At first, I was under the impression that he meant she had passed away. Then, upon observing the gloomy expression I had on my face, he elaborated by saying that she had actually vanished. I gazed at him in a bewildered manner. Something caught my attention in his eyes that I had never noticed there before. Something that made my heart skip a beat and fill me with dread. The chief exhibited signs of fear. He admitted to me that he was at a loss for words on how to interpret it himself. Around 2 a.m, those in the rooms adjacent to Mrs. Garrity's reported hearing blood-curdling cries and noises of fighting coming from her room, but after that, they heard nothing. They contacted the local law enforcement agency. Pete and Vance were the first ones to arrive at the location. They had knocked on the door repeatedly, but there was no response from anyone. They had opened the door by using force. After observing the contents of the container, they decided to contact the chief personally. I questioned him with, "What did they find?" "Perhaps you ought to come see for yourself," he suggested to me as he led me to the entrance of the building and passed me the yellow crime scene tape. He told me that they had not discovered any evidence of a forced entry, and that the door and windows of the hotel room had all been shut from the inside when Pete and Vance arrived. He also told me that they had not discovered any evidence of a break-in. As I looked around, a chill ran through my body, and I took a closer look. The room was covered in fresh blood that had been splattered all over it. On the walls, the bed, the floor, and even the ceiling, they were covered. It appeared as if someone had urgently struggled to grasp onto the blood-stained bed sheets as they were being hauled out of bed since they had been torn away from the mattress. On the carpet, there were 10 very thin trails of blood flowing away from the bed in different directions. There were 10 small trails of blood that had been formed by 10 fingers that were desperately and terrifiedly groping for purchase as their owner was being pulled away. I traced the bloody finger marks all the way across the floor, away from the bed, until I found where they terminated. In the storage room. After glancing at them, I turned my attention to the chief. He turned his head around and looked at me with a stony and expressionless face, yet terror could be seen in his eyes. I made my way toward the closet. There was no one there to close the door. I just stood there for a while, peering in through the window. There was no one in the closet. Totally devoid of any content. Even blood hadn't been spilled upon the ground. They were never successful in locating Mrs. Garrity. She continued by saying, "I would say it's been about a month since it began." At that very moment, I became aware of someone scratching on my closet door. It seemed like someone was scratching softly and slowly inside her bedroom closet at night. The sound was consistent. At first, She had speculated that it was most likely a mouse or some other type of small mammal. The only problem was that the scratching seemed to come from far higher up than a mouse could reach. When she opened the door to the closet, always after the scratching had stopped, there was nothing there. She checked this several times. She had tried several times to open the closet door while the scratching was going on in order to get to the bottom of it once and for all. But each time she had grasped the knob, she had been overcome with a sudden overwhelming, irrational sense of unease and had been unable to do it. She had tried several times to open the closet door while the scratching was going on in order to get to the bottom of it once and for all. The sound of the scratching was far too deliberate and far too gentle. Far too seemingly innocent. It was almost as if someone or something was attempting to coax her into opening the door to the closet. She had gotten into the habit of shutting her closet door every night for her own protection. Over the course of the next few days, the sound of scratching had grown increasingly loud and powerful, giving the impression that something was attempting to bore its way through the wood. When she opened her closet door one day, she saw claw prints on the opposite side of the door, claw marks that were positioned 6 feet above the ground. Claw marks that appeared to have been produced by fingernails or other sharp objects. After hearing the scratching sounds for the first time, Mrs. Kelly had to wait approximately a week before she started to feel truly terrified. She remembered waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of a kind voice asking for her. A voice that sounded as though it was emanating from behind the closed and locked closet door. She was confused, and the fact that she recognized that voice made her confusion even worse. It had been Bill's, her late husband's, belonging all along. Bill's voice had pleaded with her to open the door to the closet, telling her that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven where they could be together again, and young, like they had been when they had first met, for all of eternity. Bill had said that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven because God wanted them to be together forever. At this moment, Tom was sitting on the opposite side of the couch from me, and he gazed at me with wide eyes. And after that, what took place? I nudged her in a kind manner. "Mrs. Kelly said, at first I believed I was dreaming. At first, I believed it must have been a dream. It had been 3 years since poor Bill had been seen. And given that I was in the midst of a dream, I didn't think it would be a problem to comply with what he was requesting of me. I sprang out of bed and made my way to the storage cupboard. I put my hand on the lock, but I pulled back before I could turn it. There was an unsettling feeling that things wasn't quite right. It was Bill's voice, and while it appeared to be entirely normal, it was also in some strange way incorrect. It wasn't at all like Bill used to talk in the way that he was doing it at all. It was as if an unknown person was speaking to me in Bill's voice in an attempt to deceive me into opening that closet door. That doesn't make much sense, does it? However, despite the fact that nothing she was saying made any sense to us, we persisted in asking her to continue narrating her narrative. Bill, or whoever or whatever was using his voice, had kept pleading with her to unlock the closet even after she had done so. The tone of the voice had become hostile and threatening when she had refused, and it had changed as well. It had first demanded angrily that she open the door, and when she continued to refuse, it had started shouting at her, using profanity, and making vulgar threats, things Bill never would have said to me when he was alive, before proceeding to pound violently on the door. The voice had begun to alter, and it was no longer reminiscent of the one that belonged to her late spouse. It had deepened and warped to the point where it didn't sound human anymore. She had been so terrified that she had run out of her bedroom and spent the night on the couch in the living room. After some time had passed, both the hammering and the threats ceased. At this moment, Tom interrupts Mrs. Kelly in a manner that is polite and asks, "Mrs. Kelly, why didn't you call us at the police station when this happened?" She was silent for a brief period of time, and then a frown creased the corners of her mouth before she smiled. She revealed this information to us and said, "I assumed you'd think I was just imagining it. I am aware that the citizens of this town believe that I am an insane old lady. And I've brought you all out here so many times in the past for things that turned out to be completely unimportant. I didn't want to worry you about it since I thought maybe it was all in my brain." After that point, the situation had worsened really rapidly. The constant hammering and threats had been going on night after night. Because she was so terrified, she had began sleeping on the couch in the living room rather than in her own bedroom. Then, One night, the pounding had began, and it had not just been on the door to her bedroom closet, rather, it had begun simultaneously on all of the closet doors in the home. She explained to us that it sounded like there were individuals in all of them wanting to get out at the same time, but that we were hearing the same voice in each closet. It was the same dreadful voice. She was so terrified that she had fastened all of the closet doors shut in order to prevent the monster, whatever it was, from escaping and coming after her. After that, around 2 weeks ago, something that was much more horrifying had taken place. After a moment, she emerged from the bathroom, where she had been washing her hands in the sink. When she had gazed into the mirror on the top of the medicine cabinet, she halted her speech here. Tom questioned her by asking, "What did you see?" Whimpering through her clenched teeth, she managed to get out, "I saw it." Instead of seeing my own face, I saw its face. It was dressed in a long, dark robe with a hood over its head, and instead of a face, it had the appearance of a smirking skull. A horned skull or a horned skull. The color of its eyes was crimson. Those of the devil himself, in his own eyes. When I say that I saw it standing behind me in the mirror, what I really mean is that I saw it in the mirror itself. A chill ran up my spine at the thought of it. It tried to grab me after reaching out of the mirror with what appeared to be claws because it didn't have any hands. She had shattered the glass of the mirror in her panic by hurling a bottle of lotion at it, and then, out of an abundance of caution, she had done the same thing to all of the other mirrors in the home. How in the world were you able to continue living in this place with everything that was going on? I asked her. She gave a pitiful shrug. There is nowhere else for me to go, and no one who is willing to take me in. The nights were horrible, but the days were invariably far better than the nights. At least I would be able to get some sleep after that. It never continued beyond the morning hours, and it never occurred during the day. She trembled all of a sudden. Up until the past 3 days. After that, it became something that occurred frequently. The day and the night, no matter what hour it was, I was never in a safe environment. Late this morning was when everything finally came to a head. The pounding had been going on for some time, but it had recently become much more intense and strong, to the point where all of the closet doors were shaking in their frames. Even though the boards had been put over them, Mrs. Kelly was well aware that it was only a matter of time before whatever it was managed to break through. She had resorted to praying and reading from the Bible out of desperation, but all it did was make the entity that was hiding in the closet laugh sarcastically at her. At long last, she opened the door to the closet, pulled out Bill's shotgun, and fired it through the opening. She shared with us that for around 1 minute, there was complete silence. At first, I couldn't help but think that it was finally done. Then, I noticed those fiery red eyes glowing in the shadows. In the crater that was created by the shotgun. It made a chuckling sound, and it only spoke to me in one word. What word did it say? I asked her. She said the word tonight before her voice began to shake. She buried her face in her hands and started crying again as she bowed her head. Tom and I were both trying to take in what she had just shared with us, so we were silent for a while. We exchanged looks, each of us clearly shaken by the events she had described. Of course, not one of us genuinely believed it, but it was clear that the poor woman was going through a lot of emotional turmoil. She was experiencing some kind of breakdown in her mental health. It's possible that her tenuous hold on reality eventually gave way, or that the effects of advancing age were beginning to show in her mental capacity. It was quite evident that she could no longer be left alone, since doing so put her in danger. Especially not in this location. It was not good for her health. For all we knew, her paranoid delusions could have been caused by a harmful type of mold that had grown inside the house. It was not a healthy environment for her. Tom and I asked for a moment's break, and then we exited the building to have our conversation in private. We were both in agreement that she required assistance. It was necessary to put her in a mental hospital. But for the time being, it would be best if she stayed elsewhere. We turned around and went back inside, where we informed Mrs. Kelly that she would be accompanying us. It was planned that she would spend the night in a room at a motel in the city. And tomorrow, Tom said, we were going to find a priest who would come and exorcise the evil spirit that had been bothering her, removing it once and for all, We were going to do this so that she would no longer have to worry about it. She sobbed again, this time with happiness in her eyes, and embraced both me and my boyfriend while again expressing her gratitude to us. After checking her into a low-cost motel in the city, we drove her there. Since she has been removed from that place for such a short period of time, it appears that her mental health has already begun to improve. She flashed us a grin and said that she couldn't wait to get a night of restful sleep without having to be concerned about whatever it was that was pounding on the doors during the night. I believe the primary emotion she was feeling was relief that she would no longer have to be terrified of the being that she was sure was hiding somewhere in her home. We both gave her a kind grin and waved goodbye before getting back into the cruiser and leaving. As soon as we moved away from the motel, the smiles on our faces began to vanish. Both of us kept our voices down as we drove. In spite of the fact that she had caused a nuisance for the police department on numerous occasions by making false calls and behaving in an unpredictable manner, we both liked old Mrs. Kelly. We were saddened to learn that her mental health had deteriorated to the point where she was unable to care for herself anymore. After we had returned, we related her account to the chief. He groaned with disappointment and nodded, indicating his agreement with the fact that she needed to be institutionalized somewhere. Tomorrow, he and I were going to get in the car and drive out to see her son and daughter in order to give them a personal explanation of what had been going on. And in the event that they continued to refuse to carry out the necessary actions, the chief would take it upon himself to ensure that Mrs. Kelly received the assistance she required. But that opportunity never presented itself to us. When Tom and I dropped Mrs. Kelly off at the motel, that was the very last time any of us ever saw her. I received an urgent phone call from the chief at approximately 4 in the morning the next day, and he instructed me to report to the motel as soon as I was able to do so. On the other hand, I had a sneaking suspicion that it had something to do with Mrs. Kelly even if he wouldn't tell me why over the phone. As I was getting dressed, an overwhelming feeling of fear came over me. After we had left her at the motel, I couldn't help but wonder whether or not she had committed herself in her room. When I arrived at the motel, I found that the door to Mrs. Kelly's room had been blocked off with crime scene tape, which confirmed the worst of my suspicions. Outside, the chief, Tom, Pete, and Vance, along with a couple of officers from the state police and 2 detectives from the city, were gathered. Also present were a few of state troopers. When I approached, the chief greeted me with a solemn expression on his face. He told Mrs. Kelly that she was no longer there. At first, I was under the impression that he meant she had passed away. Then, upon observing the gloomy expression I had on my face, he elaborated by saying that she had actually vanished. I gazed at him in a bewildered manner. Something caught my attention in his eyes that I had never noticed there before. Something that made my heart skip a beat and fill me with dread. The chief exhibited signs of fear. He admitted to me that he was at a loss for words on how to interpret it himself. Around 2 in the morning, those in the rooms adjacent to Mrs. Kelly's reported hearing blood-curdling cries and noises of fighting coming from her room, but after that, they heard nothing. They contacted the local law enforcement agency. Pete and Vance were the first ones to arrive at the location. They had knocked on the door repeatedly, but there was no response from anyone. They had opened the door by using force. After observing the contents of the container, they decided to contact the chief personally. I questioned him with, "What did they find?" "Perhaps you ought to come see for yourself," he suggested to me as he led me to the entrance of the building and passed me the yellow crime scene tape. He told me that they had not discovered any evidence of a forced entry, and that the door and windows of the hotel room had all been shut from the inside when Pete and Vance arrived. He also told me that they had not discovered any evidence of a break-in. As I looked around, a chill ran through my body, and I took a closer look. The room was covered in fresh blood that had been splattered all over it. On the walls, the bed, the floor, and even the ceiling, they were covered. It appeared as if someone had urgently struggled to grasp onto the blood-stained bed sheets as they were being hauled out of bed since they had been torn away from the mattress. On the carpet, there were 10 very thin trails of blood flowing away from the bed in different directions. There were 10 small trails of blood that had been formed by 10 fingers that were desperately and terrifiedly groping for purchase as their owner was being pulled away. I traced the bloody finger marks all the way across the floor, away from the bed, until I found where they terminated. In the storage room. After glancing at them, I turned my attention to the chief. He turned his head around and looked at me with a stony and expressionless face, yet terror could be seen in his eyes. I made my way toward the closet. There was no one there to close the door. I just stood there for a while, peering in through the window. There was no one in the closet. Totally devoid of any content. Even blood hadn't been spilled upon the ground. They were never successful in locating Mrs. Kelly. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe. Compared to other professions, police job is one of the most demanding in the world. We are in a position to make life-altering decisions, but we also have to live with the repercussions for the rest of our lives. There are many people who have difficulty dealing with that. When people who are visibly unprepared find themselves in dangerous situations, we observe what happens. It ends in a tragedy. You must accept that you will make decisions that will be with you for the rest of your life. Those choices have consequences. Sometime very rapidly. You have to decide when enough is enough as time goes on. However, it's not just the decisions you make for others that are critical. Even if they're just for you, the choices you make will have an impact. We were seated across from the chief in his office, with Detective Aaron and myself. It had been routine for the two of us to be together in recent months. It's funny to think of how surprised he must have been to see us getting along despite the fact that we were among his most trusted officers. After what happened with the Hammerheads, Aaron and I got to know each other better as people. Our relationship took up from there. Looking back, it's interesting to see how adversity can unite individuals. So, the chief got started. Are you sure you'll be gone for a week? Aaron nodded in agreement. Up north, at the cabin, just like we discussed, said the friend. We were staring at him, chewing on our toothpick, for a few seconds before he turned to look at us again. In his chair, he leaned back and looked at me. Smith. What do you know about the family that went missing in the same woods where your cottage stands? A typical nuclear family camping trip with the grandparents. I was caught off guard by his query. My apologies if that was unclear. That's the first I've heard of it. I'm sure a lot of people go missing in the woods every year, don't they? He asked. He nodded his head in agreement. It's true. However, this particular family is interesting. You can see how well they were versed in the local flora and fauna. My father used to be a ranger and he's quite knowledgeable about the job. My mom is a wildlife biologist. Botany was a family tradition. The scouts included everyone, including the little ones. They were the only ones who could have survived a camping trip gone awry. However, the amount of persons who've gone missing up there has been disturbing. Aaron, do you know Sheriff Ramon Gutierrez? He inquired. Answering in the affirmative, yes sir. Yes, said she. It was a pleasure working with him, and I'd recommend him to everyone. Yes, he is, I replied. That's what the chief had to say. He just so happens to be in charge of the area where your cabin is located. I thought you could help him out a little while you were up there if you did some digging. Of course, this isn't a full-fledged probe. If you have any queries or concerns, don't hesitate to raise them. As hard as I tried, I couldn't hide my frustration with the chief. In the middle of vacationing from the craziness of police work and monsters, he wanted to use our time off to do additional investigations. Hold on, I said, interjecting. As a matter of fact, if it falls under the authority of Sheriff Cartagena, then it's his business, right? To add insult to injury, it's not our role to fix their problems because we have no authority in the region. This is something that his own team should check into. Is it so serious that we should close the forests? An expression of displeasure or respect appeared on the chief's face when I challenged him. In an attempt to simulate blowing out inert smoke, he pulled out his toothpick and made a puffing gesture with it. Because hundreds of square miles can't be isolated, it's difficult to do so. Regardless of the circumstances, people will find their way to the woods. There's no doubt in my mind that you're right, Smith. In any event, I have complete confidence in Sheriff Cartagena's handling of these cases. His men are still patrolling regularly and following up on every tip. Even though he knew it wasn't your job, he believed having an extra set of eyes and ears may be helpful. Thanks for your help, he said. To be honest, I was planning on telling Aaron that we'd prefer take a break during the break and talk to the locals, but he went ahead of me, promising that we'd do just that. Following my departure from his office, I informed her that I was unhappy with the outcome of the meeting. It was Aaron's fault, and he promised that we wouldn't call the cops too much in the future. She wanted to make the chief happy, but she also wanted to have fun. She promised not to let this small setback get in the way of her goal. With trepidation, I agreed to go ahead with the plan. After a week, we were finally able to leave. One of the finest parts of the trip was the automobile ride up north. I forgot all about my fears that our vacation might turn into a work trip as we were rapping along to Odyssey and Tupac. A tiny town diner was her destination after a 4 to 5 hour drive. When we arrived, it was immediately apparent that we stood out. Almost everyone in the restaurant had their gaze fixed on us. I tried to greet a family sitting across the table from us with a polite wave, but they simply shrugged and returned to their meal. Even though I was a little miffed, I decided to overlook it for now. When we finished eating, paid, and left, no one bothered us at all. A man dressed in an apron was admiring our car at the time. "Hey!" From the other side of the parking lot, I yelled. "Did you notice anything noteworthy about that?" The man turned to face me and smiled warmly. On the front of his apron, he sported a name tag reading, Nicholas Perez, head chef. "Oh. Hello there, y'all." He smiled as he walked over to us and greeted us warmly. I gingerly shook his hand as he put it out. A little casual for someone scoping over our vehicle, Erin thought, crossing her arms. He briefly observed the automobile before turning to face us and waving it away. "That was a great ride. I promise it wasn't anything at all. I wanted to take a closer look at the car when I was on break because I hadn't seen one like it before. Neither of you even remotely resembles someone from this region. My guess is that you're in town." Reaction, I said. "We're not going to go to some borrasca in the middle of the mountains where you've got a lot of other guys tied up just to slash our tires. This is all I wanted to let you know. We have firearms on us." He chuckled when I told him my story. "The term borrasca has never occurred to me, but I must say, you have a vivid imagination. Being from the north, I can't say that violence is something I support. Canadian hospitality is what I strive for in my business here, I say." "And who are your customers?" inquired Aaron. "Their demeanor isn't the most welcoming." Nicholas just shrugged his shoulders. "It's not that they aren't friendly. Lately, we've been experiencing a slew of difficulties. People used to compliment us on our meals and conversation with the locals. Always on their way out of town, they'd drop in. This year, not a single instance like this has occurred. The morbid fascination that greets newcomers now, I believe, is the best way to describe it." "Those disappearances," I said, "I've heard about them. Do you have any knowledge of them?" He nodded and shook his head. "Sorry. I wish I could. Everyone in town has a true fear of going outside into the woods even for a short time. This is a phrase that we've coined. Take it or leave it, the trees watch you, so do as you please." Nervously, he giggled. "Anyhow, I'm babbling. I'll stop. Wishing you and yours the best of luck in the great outdoors." He returned to the diner and finished his meal. In spite of the message's dire tone, it offered no new information. It was the same for me every time I got a new case. When I looked over to Erin, she seemed immersed in contemplation as well. She insisted she was okay when I inquired whether she was okay. We decided to depart as soon as possible, not wanting to dwell on the incident any longer. My phone lit up with a text message as soon as we climbed into the car. "Talked to Sheriff Cartagena today," said the chief. A backpacker's relative stated that she never returned. He was only 18 at the time of the incident. "What's going on here?" I let out a sigh of relief. I was eager to lend a hand. With every mile we traveled, it seemed as though the environment was shifting, putting us in a scenario we didn't intend to be in. An enjoyable vacation was quickly turning into something far more terrible. Angry over the situation, I didn't utter a word as we drove along. Erin made a hard right at the next crossroads out of nowhere after picking up on the change in tone. Our route was going in the wrong direction based on my instructions. As soon as I tried to bring it up, she shook her head and said, "Didn't want to ruin the surprise." Later, we arrived at a medium-sized wooded home, and Erin was ordering me to get out of his car. Rusticity was heightened by the overgrown vegetation surrounding the building. While walking outdoors, I was perplexed and questioned, "What are we doing here?" She greeted me on my side of the car and said, "We're going to get drunk and hear some wonderful stories," with a huge smile on her face. "Where?" I inquired. "Is there something I'm missing? The cabin is supposed to be our destination, right?" As she approached the front door and knocked, Erin giggled. "Believe in me. My family has known him for a long time. Since I was a kid, I've made a point of stopping over to see him whenever I was up here." As I remained perplexed, I arched an eyebrow and crossed my arms as I looked at her in puzzlement. "To wit, I'm game, but doesn't that seem a little out of left field?" She knocked on the door a second time before answering my question. "Mr. Tom, on the other hand, is a lot of fun. He's a great storyteller. Moreover, because he was a bartender, he has the best cocktails. A few drinks and some good times seemed like a good idea to me. Since we've been on the road all day, we should resume our journey tomorrow. It's possible, but only if he unlocks this century." That was my remark, by the way. She gave a shaky sigh and a concerned expression. Her fingers barely made contact with the wood before the door swung open. However, the person on the other end was not the grizzled old man that Erin had depicted. In our estimation, she was in her early 20s. It looked like she hadn't slept in a while, what with her hair in a ponytail and her drowsy eyes. When the woman didn't answer, Erin went into police mode and groped for a gun that wasn't there before bombarding her with questions. "Who are you, and why are you at Mr. Tom's house?" is the most frequently asked question. The young woman yawned and casually said, "I'm Fernanda. By the way, I'm a student at this university. As of January 1st, no one has seen Grandpa. The only thing I'm doing is keeping an eye on things." Erin let her body to relax after realizing she was only a relative. Her tone, on the other hand, suggested that she was still wary of this alleged great-granddaughter. After taking a few deep breaths, she exclaimed, "Oh. A friend of the family, I'm sorry if I've scared you. My knowledge of Mr. Tom's death was not made clear to me. Since the beginning of the year, you said? Do you have any idea when he left?" An unenthusiastic, half-hearted response came from Fernanda. "February? That can't be any later than it was. On his desk was written, 'I'll be traveling a lot.'" Erin paused and indicated for me to come closer to them after considering this for a while. "Interesting. Is your granddad still alive?" She gave a shaky sigh. "Nope. In spite of the fact that he has not returned since he left, I am confident that he is doing well." That line piqued my interest. "Wait, so you're just like the rest of us? Who exactly are the other people?" After I asked her a question, her entire demeanor changed. Her gaze quickly shifted to the woods beyond our line of sight. The intonation of her speech changed to one of minor discomfort as a hesitant smile appeared on her face. "Oh. By generally, I just meant that Grandpa is a tough cookie. He told me a few days earlier that he was doing great." In an effort to prevent me from pressing further, Erin interrupted me and said, "My error, then. Sorry for the inconvenience, we'll be right there." We went without saying a word. I was taken aback by the abruptness of the departure. It seemed as if we had a direct link to the mysterious disappearances. How could such a tough guy want to just throw it away? It was a 2-hour drive from the Tom home to the cabin, and I spent the majority of that time trying to get her to explain why she didn't press it. When we arrived, I had hoped to make a stronger point, but my attention was immediately drawn to the stunning scenery. Enormous stretches of lush green forest, undulating hills and boundless nature made for an unforgettable view. The cabin's design was highly contemporary. It was big enough to fit a family, yet not so big that you felt claustrophobic. A little lake and a fire pit were only a short distance away from it. "This is lovely," I exclaimed as I gazed at the scenery. "This is all ours." Aaron agreed. "Yup. Nothing except us, Mother Nature, and whatever monstrous creatures happen to be paying us a visit. Our knowledge of monstrosities is nil. The size of this forest is undeniable. A lot of folks get lost here. A rogue predator may have realized that it is simpler to hunt people than deer." She sighed and sat down on the bed, ignoring him. "I'm hoping you're right. There have been a lot of unusual incidents since we arrived. That's usually a sign of something significant. So that's why you promised the chief that you'd investigate it, right?" She changed her demeanor, which told me that my question was misunderstood. "Don't do that!" she screamed. "This is the only place I'd rather have you and I be than anywhere else." It felt like the simplest way to accomplish that goal was to appease the chief. Plus, I still have a nagging sense of duty to complete my work. I threw up my hands and apologized profusely, saying I had no idea what I had done. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she was eager to take on the challenge of solving the puzzles. That, too, was something I admired about him. In an effort to cool down, Aaron took a deep breath and apologized for his outbursts. She told me how difficult it was for her to find the right balance between her professional and personal commitments. It's a sentiment with which I can empathize. The way she was doing it was good with me. We both decided to deal with the situation as it arose since we both wanted to spend time with her. We, of course, intend to take full use of the stunning surroundings. However, if something unexpected came our way, we'd be prepared. A campfire provided a warm place to tell stories about our day's adventures in the woods. In the middle of the night, we made arrangements to go exploring and trek up to a vantage point with a view of miles of woodland. The ideal scenario would be for us to spend the night up there, return, prepare a meal, practice shooting with the firearms she'd left there, and then relax by the lake. After a good night's sleep, the next morning everything appeared to be heading in the right way. It was time to get up and get ready for the day. I was a little surprised by the difficulty of the trail. The health-conscious Aaron, who is an avid runner, was even gracious enough to slow down to allow me to keep up. When we finally reached the summit, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The view was completely out of character for me. Infinite rows of vivid green trees stretched over the sky. In front of us, in the form of towering mountains, was a world of ecological wonders just waiting to be found. When the sun's rays hit the surface of the neighboring lake, it appeared as if hundreds of crystals had taken up residence. It was like a dream come true. Having Aaron there was the icing on the cake. Her eyes betrayed a great sense of gratitude for the opportunity to witness such a rare event. My life felt like a constant battle between witnessing the worst of people and seeing the worst of paranormal activity. I could feel my sanity eroding with each new case that came my way. However, the world seemed right for the first time in a long time. There was a sense of calm in the air. We returned to the cabin after about an hour due to hunger. There was something in my gut that told me that tranquil moment would be our last on this journey, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Because I didn't want to scare Aaron, I kept my mouth shut in the vain hope that my fears were unfounded. My suspicions were realized as we came to the end of the trail and saw the cabin for the first time. A woman was lying in the fetal position on the porch. As I instinctively took my pocket knife from my back pocket, Aaron did the same. As I gently approached the subject, I yelled, "Hey! You must identify yourself before entering this private property." I knew the woman on the porch as soon as she looked up at us. "Fernanda?" Aaron screamed in horror as he was stunned by the news. "When I first saw you here, I was flabbergasted. What brings you here?" Before I had a chance to intervene, she had already hurried up to the young girl and been guiding her back into her house. Aaron's enthusiasm for helping the granddaughter of a childhood friend was understandable, but this was clearly out of whack. Fernanda was sobbing uncontrollably on the couch when I finally arrived. Despite our best efforts, Fernanda refused to provide any information about what had transpired or how she had gotten up at the cottage. Before she had a full-blown panic episode, she went off on a tangent about being driven there. After a stressful day, she needed some time to relax. By walking down to the lake, Erin and I decided to offer her some privacy. "Tell me you don't think this is unusual," I remarked to Erin as soon as we were out of earshot. She was offended by what I said. "It's only natural that I find this strange. Think I'm naive enough to believe this is normal behavior? The truth is, it's just. I'm not sure we should have taken her in so quickly. By now, you and I should be able to deduce that this is very close to Nopeland." "You have my full attention now, Dre," I say. I'm baffled as to how she managed to get here at all. If I didn't already know where I was, I didn't see any other vehicles. Anyone who has to walk the road to get here has a tough day. To me, Mr. Tom is more like family. I need to be there for his kid if she gets into problems. It doesn't matter whether it's odd. There was no part of me that liked the response, and frankly, I don't know if I would have allowed her to stay. But in the end, I didn't get to make the decision. I had to appreciate and trust Erin since this was her retreat. "Okay," I said without hesitation. We returned to the house soon after and found Fernanda had calmed down a little more. As I was brewing coffee for everyone, I asked her if she felt comfortable talking about what had happened. She said she was. She nodded and wiped the tears from her eyes. Although she made a valiant effort to look Erin in the eyes before answering, she eventually cast her face downward and broke down in tears once more, yelling, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. How could you?" Erin sank to his knees, confused, and placed a hand on the child's shoulder. "You lied? To what end? Which one? You ask." "Granddad. He was never on a vacation. As far as I know, he's gone." "What?" When Erin appeared, he screamed a little. "Where and when did he disappear?" "Before the end of the year, he had a run of bad luck. He disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again." "Did you report this to the police?" I interjected. "Of course we did," Fernanda shot back. "But they'll never find him. They could search every inch of that forest, and it won't matter." My brain immediately flipped back to being a detective, and my questioning became a little bit more intense. "How could you know for a fact that they'll never find him?" For the slightest moment, she gave me an odd look. A contortion of her brows seemed to signal disbelief as if she expected me to know the answer to her question. "Because they don't know what to look for." "It's not," she sighed. "He's different now." "Advertisements." "Fernanda," Erin began. "What do you mean by different? And do you know if your grandfather is okay?" Tears began to well up in her eyes again, but oddly enough, there was a smile too. "I know for a fact that Granddad is fantastic. He's living well and better than ever." Erin and I shared a look of confusion at this statement. Literally none of this fit. In our brief moment of interaction, Erin must have been able to read my mind because she asked a question that was also at the forefront of my brain. "Fernanda, how did you know to find us here?" A moment of silence followed. Fernanda seemed to be contemplating how to tell us. Still, without her saying a word, I knew the answer would be an incredibly uncomfortable one. When she finally found the words, she simply turned to look out a window and stated, "Granddad told me." She gave us a quick glance before looking back out the window and continuing, "I can hear his voice from all around. He said a lot of things, and they scare me. You both needed to know." I didn't know what to make of what she was saying. As much as I wanted to dismiss that she was getting mental messages from her potentially dead grandfather, I'd seen too much to rule anything out. On the flip side, it also wouldn't be the first time someone had, in reality, done something awful and then played it off with talks of voices in their head. But at the end of the day, I needed to approach the situation rationally. I couldn't believe it was supernatural until I saw the supernatural. I suggested that she let us drive her into town. Ideally, we would get her checked into a hospital, and maybe she could give the local police any information garnered from the voice of her grandfather. Erin shut down the idea and instead insisted that Fernanda stay. She was adamant about monitoring her, at least for the night. Aaron later confessed that getting rid of Fernanda without calming her down under supervision would be like abandoning her. And she wouldn't do that to the family of a close friend. It was a rationale I didn't necessarily agree with, but one that I respected. We went about setting up the guest room for Fernanda and spent the rest of the day fishing and taking shifts watching over her. For most of the day, Fernanda sat silently in her room. She'd be on her bed and stare out the window, seemingly deep in thought. I'd try and talk with her, but the most I could ever get was a brief glance in my direction. Eventually, the time came for me to go to bed. I walked to the kitchen to brush my teeth and caught Fernanda sitting at the table drinking some tea. By this point, I didn't expect any sort of an acknowledgement of my presence, but to my surprise, she gave me a very warm, "Hey, Dre." A little caught off guard, I greeted her back but ultimately thought nothing of it. That is until she got up and started to walk out. Just before reaching her room, she stopped, turned around, and stared at me. An unnervingly wide smile plastered on her face. "You've seen terrible things, haven't you? Tragic." And with that, she simply went into her room. I sat in silence for some time, just thinking. Was Fernanda referring to the paranormal? The murders I've investigated in my career? Or something more personal? I hadn't known this girl for more than 48 hours, how could she be aware of anything? Either way, her statement rattled me. When I finally got to bed, Aaron asked me what took me so long, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Maybe that was a poor choice, I don't know. At a certain point, you just want to be done with the weirdness and move on. I told Aaron that I had just been thinking, and when she pressed me for details, I promised I'd tell her in the morning. Luckily she accepted my answer. Aaron drifted off fast in my arms. But despite her being right there with me, I felt alone. Fernanda's words unearthing a river of memories that I floated down. Reflections of my life, my mistakes, and the choice I've yet to make lulled me into a largely dreamless sleep. A ritual that I had grown accustomed to. Oddly enough, the only mental image I can recall was that of the Watcher saying we'd all be safer with them. I don't know how much I slept, but it was clearly very early in the morning when I woke up. The sun had just begun to rise, and Fernanda had the blanket pulled over her face on the other side of the bed. I sat with my eyes open for a moment when the realization hit me that I wasn't going to be able to fall back asleep. With a quiet groan, I pulled myself out of bed, put on some clothes, and walked over to the kitchen to grab some water and brush my teeth. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was 9mm ammo had been left on the table. Confused, I walked over to Fernanda's room and found that she had left. Her space was clean, and nothing indicated that she had left in a hurry. At first, I figured that she had likely gone into the woods to shoot. Perhaps Aaron told her where to find the gun while watching over her. When I went outside to try and find Fernanda, I immediately noticed more bullets had been dropped, and they led to a nearby trail. As I walked to the trailhead, I heard a gunshot coming from that same direction. I figured I'd follow the trail and hopefully meet up with her at some point. But not too long after I started walking, I heard an eerily familiar voice call out to me from deep in the forest. A voice so familiar, in fact, that it froze me in place. I dared not move from my spot in hopes that it would call out again. Tears began to make their way down my face. I knew that it was probably some fucked up trick being played on me, but I didn't care. The moment I recognized that it was my son's voice calling out to me. My baby boy calling for his father, I sprinted off towards it. I'd seen so much in my time investigating the paranormal that I suppose a small piece of me hoped that somehow, some way, something had brought him back. Even if there was a 1% chance, I had to take it. I ran and ran. My boy guiding me towards his location. I called out to him. He needed to know that his father was finally going to be there for him. I had no idea where I was headed, and I didn't care. I just kept going until I physically couldn't any longer. But ultimately, my efforts had brought me no closer to him. Instead, I found myself in a grave situation. I had blindly run off trail into the woods. And now, I was surrounded by nothing but trees. How could I be so stupid? I thought to myself. The voice had seemed so real. But the only thing it had led me to was getting lost. It was the first time I had to consider whether or not I was indeed going mad. Seeing what looked like a face lodged in the wood of a tree to my right only served to strengthen my suspicions. Whoever it was appeared to be in excruciating pain, with their face contorted in agony. Face pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns, is the most likely explanation for this. However, even if it was just a random pattern, it was a compelling one. In the blink of an eye, the bark had grown around this person, taking a picture of their pain. The same thing happened when I stepped over to look at the tree behind it. Another person is in excruciating pain and appears to be locked in place. That was matched by a third tree, as well. Fourth time lucky. An army of scared faces quickly formed around me. My son's voice burst through the bewilderment before I could even begin to think about what may have prompted this messed up exhibition. I was able to locate the source in no time. An unusually slender and young tree in the forest. Some distance off from the rest. The visage of a young child was at its core. He appeared to be inconsolable. His face was covered with ice-cold tears, and I rushed over to brush them away and kiss his head. As I hugged the tree, a sliver of joy slipped into my face. That was an inordinately long time since I'd seen my son's face. "It's okay to laugh, Dad. At long last, you're here." He told me that. My tears were swiftly brushed away as I tried to figure out how he got there. "It was a little dimmer," he said. "After that day. It was pitch black. But one day, I felt like I had a new lease on life. Growth. And the agony? Then it was merely a glimmer of light. I wanted to ask how I could help, what I could do, and how I could get involved. However, something else came up before I had a chance to do so. "It's been so long, my darling." It was uttered in a voice that sounded like a honeycomb. "Aaliyah." I yelled back in response. How are you, and? I'm curious." "Alive?" She chuckled quietly, her voice trembling. "That's not because of you, cowardly scumbag." "What?" I shook my head in astonishment as I inquired. "It's not. How is it possible that this is true? Isn't it?" "Oh, yes." Her voice grew more sinister. "Love, you abandoned your wife and child to their deaths. For the sake of your career, please look for a new position. I warned you that placing individuals behind bars would engender animosity. I said so, and here we are." She was encouraging me to finish her sentence, but I was unable to do it. A firm no is heard. That's all I could manage to murmur beneath my breath. "Not possible!" exclaimed the student. I rose to my feet and yelled. "You're not one of them. You're an apparition of some sort. You're lying." The tree began to speak again. I didn't identify this one. Deep and monotonous, this voice is. An outright fabrication? Smith, that is not the case. We are the truth. In other words, we are life itself. Finally, the curtain had come down on the play. I was convinced that something nefarious was mimicking my relatives, and I was enraged. How could you possibly have such a bleak existence? Please have a look around you. All I perceive is a sickening resemblance to death. It chuckled a sarcastic laugh of displeasure. We progress. Cell division is a normal process in the human body. You call it death when we use the sun's rays to generate electricity? We have resurrected the spirit of the dead by reanimating their husks. There are mycelial networks and roots that extend from here to your house and much further. Everything is interconnected with us. Everything is absorbed by us. Our eyes are everywhere. In a matter of seconds, it changed to that of a little girl. Detective Smith, do you remember me? Who am I? That's interesting, I thought. You killed me because you were too self-assured to call me back. Even if your life is at stake, you can choose to battle on. Isn't it ironic that you wanted all the glory for yourself but couldn't bear the heat when it got too much? Coward. In other words, Faye Mizuki had risen from the dead. I was speechless as I stared into the face of the greatest failure of my professional life. Again, the tone changed. As soon as it introduced itself, I blurted out her name in disbelief at the entity's decision. Fernanda? You're absolutely correct. Smith, you know there is a better way. One that will allow you to atone for the horrors you've witnessed and perpetrated. My grandfather had been talking to me about joining this and becoming something even greater. At first, it was a little unnerving. I'm pondering the possibility of a new beginning. However, our mood has completely changed. You do realize that's how he came upon you? He'd been here the entire time. It's all over. After what felt like an eternity, I finally got myself together enough to leave this dreadful place. Fernanda, my goodness. I'm very sorry, she said. What's the point of being sorry? This is what it's like to live. We'll outlive everyone for eons before regenerating into something entirely new. I can tell you're nervous, but you don't sound like it. Don't worry, you weren't the only one who was nervous. However, I can assure you that they are considerably happier now. Wait a minute. There are other people here? I inquired, of course. Are you referring to the folks who have gone missing? That's where they've ended up, Jesus. You drew them in with a tempting offer and then, when they were happy, they showed it to them. End of monotonous screams. In my opinion, there is no better heaven than this. This must be the reason for their excruciating pain, right? I spit in his face. Wow! What a variety of expressions. It didn't flinch or falter in its delivery. In other words, growth is a painful process. I felt something slash at my leg as it uttered this. Self-actualization is essential to well-being. To be joyful, you need to go through hardships. Despite my desire to fight this evil, my leg began to numb and my eyelids began to droop. My next few sentences were a muddled mess, but I was awake and aware enough to realize how serious this situation actually was. When I tried to make a U-turn, my foot got caught on a wayward root, and I fell to the ground. The trees appeared to have grown in size. I could feel their woody tentacles wrapping around my calf as they raced towards me. I yelled, "Get away!" But it was ineffective. I was engulfed by a sea of voices from all ways. Many of them I had never heard of before. "This is the place for you. We're stronger together," one of them declared. "In the end, what's the point? You can't do anything about it." Another person entered the conversation. I couldn't break free of the organism's grip on my leg, no matter how hard I tried. There were still more mycelial twigs and roots sprouting around me when my vision went dark. My final idea was that, at the absolute least, I would be reunited with my family. As a result, there was complete silence. There aren't any. There's nothing there. I felt cut off from the rest of the world. And it was in that silence that I felt free to let go. My world was suddenly filled with light once more. Waves of anguish followed the dry heave. Aaron had his eyes fixed on me. Despite the fact that we were still outside, our location had changed somewhat. She embraced me tightly before I could finish what I was saying. In front of her, she placed an axe that had been covered in plant materials. "What happened?" was all I could muster. After she awoke, Aaron allegedly realized Fernanda and I were absent. She was worried about the ammo left on the table, especially in light of earlier tales of missing people, so she went out in search of us with an axe. A few extra rounds left at the northern trail's head gave her a hint as to where we were headed. She also heard a voice that pointed her in the right direction. It's her father's legacy. Aaron, on the other hand, was less enthralled by the call. Almost my entire body was covered in the green and white tendrils when she eventually discovered me. During the process of entering my body through several wounds, they wriggled and expanded. A half hour later, she had completely cut me out of the conversation. What I couldn't understand was how she was able to completely disregard the presence of the demon. It can't just let her walk away with me. And, unsurprisingly, it didn't work out that way. Her history murmured beautiful nothings of endless life, happiness, and unlimited expansion to her. In the same way as she had done at the end of a bullet, even Fernanda had tried to persuade Aaron to go on to the next life. She had to maintain a steady offensive in order to avoid joining the real Legion of the Dead for every mycelia and root she severed. In the end, she only pulled me a short distance before I was able to escape the monster that had captured me. I was at a loss for words. What else am I supposed to say? As I listened to her story, I sat there in awe. For all that I've seen and all that I've endured. I was injured, afraid, and slammed. But I had never experienced anything like that before. A mental breakdown has never occurred to me in my life. He stayed with me the entire time I was gathering my thoughts, until I eventually said, "Let's go home." We returned home in silence after a fast packing session. When we finally arrived at my house, I stepped out of the car silently. Our only form of communication was a kiss on the forehead. All week long, it was just like that. At home, I spent the most of my time pondering. When the time came for me to return to work, I put on my best suit, arrived on time, and went straight to the chief's office to hand in my badge, pistol, and resignation letter in person. I told him, "I'm done." He had a look at the products for a while before making a decision. It was at this point that he sat back in his chair and said, "About time." I was enraged by his smug demeanor. That was all I got after going through hell and back for him so many times? It was a slap in the face. You could be asking yourself, what the hell does that even mean? I mumbled a half scream. "I'm sorry, but no thanks." Apparently no one is trying to persuade me to stay. Just a snide observation? My resignation letter was gently picked up and placed in his inbox on his desk by him. When Smith's family died, how many days did he take off from work? No. I can't remember. However, what does that have to do with? None. He stepped in to make a statement. There is not a single day of vacation. Yes, homicide was a terrible crime. Challenging. But well, at least you tried. The quality of your work has never been compromised. No one ever heard you whine. Compared to the vast majority of people, Smith's ability to cope with hardship is astounding. That came at the right time. I couldn't have done it without you. It's impressive that you've been through so much and still managed to see things through to the end. Even if 99% of individuals understood this was part of the job, most of them wouldn't join the police force. I didn't feel any better after listening to his speech. So you've exploited my emotional scars? That's great, right? The answer is no. Opened his drawer and pulled out an unwrapped cigar, placing it in his lips before lighting it in a single motion. I know it's against the rules, but what the heck? I'm not a cold-hearted scumbag. In my heart, I don't want anyone else to have to go through this. Not someone who has seen so much, to be sure. In some ways, I wish that you had walked away. But, taking a deep breath and a fresh inhalation, he finally came to a halt. However, there are some things that must be done. This has to be dealt with by someone. In my heart, Smith, I'd like to do the right thing. You were the ideal person to assist me in that endeavor. It's more than just my or your feelings. That's your prerogative to judge. Even though I know it will be difficult to replace you, there is a part of me that is delighted to see you depart. Because it's long overdue, he concludes. His statements had a greater impact on me than I expected. I remained silent, unsure of what to say. In the end, I chose to remain silent. It took some time for this to sink in. It's all here. That was the end of our conversation. I went away without saying another word after that. In the months and years that followed, I made every effort to get my life back to normal. Aaron, I'm writing this while you're in the other room. Our baby shower is coming up, so I should note that Eveline is talking to a couple of our close friends about it. In Officer Ryan's opinion, this is the most exciting opportunity of his career. The father of our children insists on their friendship. I've gained so much insight into these events as a result of writing these stories. Retelling these stories and hearing from you all has meant a lot to me, and I want to express my gratitude for that. At this point in my life, I recognize that the truth is the most valuable gift I can give to others, and sharing that knowledge makes me happy. The monsters, on the other hand, haven't shown up at all. It's no surprise that life is much better now that they're gone. As a matter of fact, Eveline came home from work the other day telling about how a birthday celebration ended up with numerous people killed. It was said that a neighbor made a remark regarding a clown, but he or she refused to go further. Those old urges resurfaced when she informed me, and I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end. A part of me thinks it's pointless to conduct some investigation and speak with a few people to make sure that everyone is okay. Then again, another portion of my brain tells me to take it easy. It's a question I've wrestled with on a number of occasions. That itch isn't completely satisfied by office job. However, it's possible that it isn't. I may finally be able to be content with simply being happy. I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. It's something that has me giddy with anticipation. Everyone, please remember to be safe, and thank you for your continued support. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and enjoy the following story. For the past 5 years, Frank and I have been the only two in the house. It wasn't easy for my wife to carry him to term. Her life had been filled with close calls and near-death experiences as a result of chronic health conditions. She had been told by every doctor she had ever seen that she would never be able to conceive. Even though she tried to put on a brave face, her true thoughts were clearly visible on her face as she contemplated getting a complete litter of puppies instead of a single dog. She yearned to be a mother, and the prospect of not being able to bear children broke her heart. Of course, we talked about other possibilities. We looked into adoption, fostering, and any other option you can think of. We were even planned to meet with an adoption agency at the time of the miracle. Frank performed the miracle. Beth became pregnant in spite of all the odds. As a result, her doctors were stumped. What seemed like an impossibility at the time became a reality when we began discussing the possibility of turning our second bedroom into a nursery and figuring out how to rearrange our work schedules so that one of us could be home with the baby at all times. About 4 months into the pregnancy, the difficulties began to arise. We were in the hospital for testing and procedures every few weeks, it seemed. Beth was fantastic throughout the entire ordeal. I acted like a complete madman, worrying about every little thing, while she sat there in the hospital bed, stroking her growing tummy and smiling to herself. Everything worked out for her, and all of her problems were merely blips on the road. Just a few days after reaching the 31-week milestone, she went into labor early. She strolled into the kitchen and announced the impending arrival of her child in a calm and matter-of-fact manner. Her calm demeanor helped her locate the bag we'd already packed weeks ago and the car keys while I rushed to get dressed and gather the few remaining essentials that hadn't yet been placed into the bag. Frank was born 6 hours after his mother gave birth. My heart sank when he emerged from the womb, because he was so tiny. The doctor and a nurse immediately moved him to a heated table, where they began to treat him. To prevent me from getting in the way, a second nurse restrained me from coming too close. Everything came to a halt, and we heard the sweetest sound, our son crying. As far as I could tell from what he saw, Frank was going to be all right despite having to spend a few weeks in an intensive care unit because of his size. To keep my balance, I had to put my hand on the bed's headboard. I was very glad. When Beth's monitor's alarm went off, my fingers had barely touched the plastic. In less than an hour, Frank and I had both lost track of her. There was nothing the hospital staff did incorrectly, and nothing could have been done to avoid the incident. Her body had broken down under the strain of labor and delivery, and she had endured a significant loss of blood. Her life was saved to the best of the staff's abilities. It was simply not feasible. Before she died, she never even had a chance to hold Frank. I was never able to express my sorrow at her passing. Now that I was a single parent, the only thing on my mind was the tiny baby in the NICU. My stint at work was followed by a night at Frank's hospital where I stayed until he was well enough to leave the hospital. I was hired by a new company not long before he was freed. Despite the lower pay, I was able to work from the comfort of my own home. I had to be there for him at all times because he didn't have much of a family support system. In the end, it had just been me and him. We made an incredible child together, and I wish Beth could see him now. He's a joy to be around, a pain to deal with, and so much more. We couldn't have asked for anything more from him. I didn't believe him at first when he said he was being visited by something in the middle of the night because his imagination is so vivid for his age. It took some time, but we finally established a nightly routine. At the end of the evening, when Frank has had his bath and gone to bed, we have dinner together and then spend approximately an hour running around the house or outside depending on the weather. Every parent knows that routines aren't infallible, but this one should be done by 8 p.m. every night. On the first night he came to visit, I was unable to get him to bed until nearly 9 o'clock. When I heard Frank shout for me, I was working away at my desk, trying to catch up on some things. Shame on me for feeling irritated as soon as I heard it. Every time he made that kind of noise, it was to ask for a last drink of water or to express his displeasure at not being able to sleep. A couple of times a week is about right. That's not what I meant when I claimed that I had an exceptional child, but rather one who was prone to the typical 4-year-old behaviors. That's when I got to my feet and shoved my chair back hard enough that it fell over. His voice was filled with anxiety. When I reached the second story, I dashed up the short flight of stairs and slammed his door open, my fingers reaching for the switch. Frank's eyes welled up as he sat in his bed, sobbing. Left leg of his pajamas was raised and hands were pressed down on the skin of his lower thigh. It appeared like his bed linens and comforter had been discarded. His pillow was dangling precariously over the edge of the bed. This bed safety rail had already been installed, so I crouched down next to it and put it in place before hurrying to his side. After that, he wrapped his arms around my neck and began to sob even more fiercely. He was crying so hard that he was coughing uncontrollably. For his own safety, I peeled him away from me and placed him in my lap. It took me a long time to comfort him as he sobbed and sniffed inconsolably while I stroked his hair. I sat him on the edge of his bed and removed his hands off his leg when he finally calmed down. It had 3 long scuffs going along its length. There were a few little beads of blood in the wounds, but they weren't deep. So, I softly inquired, what happened? He kept his mouth shut. The second time I questioned him, he raised his head and looked me in the eyes. In a whisper, he confessed, "Nighty-night harmed me." I couldn't understand why he was looking at me. When he finally said, "I don't know," I had no idea what to anticipate. "What time is it?" I inquired, my voice low. "Do you remember what I tell you before you go to bed at night?" "Nighty-night," Frank said again, this time more emphatically. He rubbed against me. The wicked cat did it, too. He'd been scratched by a neighbor's kitten just after his 3rd birthday while trying to play with it. Although the claws had even pierced the skin, the memory of the experience lingered on in his mind. My apologies to the huge guy, but I'm stumped. Nighty-night is a cat, are you saying? There will be no cat. Daddy, your daughter is a monster. I was hurt by him. I re-examined the scratches on my skin. These events were clearly real, but they were also clearly not the work of a monster. Another event had occurred. To be clear, I never doubted Frank's honesty at any point during our conversation. Despite the fact that he was prone to the occasional lie, he never lied to me about anything serious. In any case, he was too terrified to invent something. In the bathroom, I snatched Frank into my arms and retrieved a first aid kit from a cupboard. During the process of putting him in my lap, I mentally smacked my forehead and sighed. I've been forgetting to cut his fingernails when I give him a bath for the past few nights. In his sleep, he must have scratched himself. In his half-asleep state, he must have regarded it as a creature attacking him. Before clipping his nails with a small silver clipper, I hastily dressed his wounds. I gave him a hug and carried him back to his room after he calmed down. To my surprise, he clung to me so firmly when I tried to put him to bed that I almost fell forward. During that particular night, he flatly refused to sleep in his own bed. We ended up sleeping together downstairs, and he was back to his normal self by the time the sun came up. It appeared as if the previous night's events had vanished into thin air. To make the most of the weekend, I took Frank out to a nearby state park. It was a fun-filled day of playing on the playground and splashing about in the lake. We were both fatigued by the time we left the park and made our way home. While driving to the house, he fell asleep in his car seat. I brought him into the house and up to his bedroom. During the entire procedure, he remained unconscious. Let him sleep for about an hour or so, I had originally intended on doing. Because he still needed to eat dinner, I was aware that it would be nearly impossible to put him to sleep if he slept too long. I took off my shoes and sat down in a chair to enjoy the silence. There wasn't a long pause in the conversation. Frank's screams broke it. Unlike the previous night, there was no yelp or weeping. Intense pain and terror fueled this cry. I ran up the stairs and rushed into his room, yelling his name as I went. Angry Frank was slumped over on the floor with a swollen eyeball and his thumb in his mouth. Slowly, he swung his hips back and forth. It appeared to him that he was aware that I was present, but that my presence had no bearing on him. The sensation of a moist and warm sensation on my hand as I scooped him up surprised me. The blood on my fingers was evident as soon as I yanked it away from his back. Once again, I carried him to the bathroom and turned on the light. As soon as I caught a glimpse of his back in the sink mirror, I felt as if ice were being poured into my veins. His clothing had been ripped to shreds, and the ones that were left were stained scarlet from the blood. I plopped Frank down on the counter and threw him the shirt. At one point, I questioned aloud if he was in shock because he remained completely silent during the procedure. The 3 cuts on his back were spaced about the same distance apart as the scrapes on his leg. These, on the other hand, went far deeper and were bleeding profusely. Before returning to the car, I wrapped his wounds as quickly as possible. My rudimentary knowledge of first aid couldn't handle the damage. He urgently required the services of a medical professional. We were in agony as we made our way to the hospital. I tried to alleviate the pressure on his back by patting his car seat with a blanket, but he began to scream in agony as soon as we started driving. Despite the fact that I knew it was against the law, I stopped, unbuckled him, and sat him sideways in the passenger seat before getting back in and continuing to drive. Maybe I should have reconsidered. I don't know for sure. The only thing I know for sure is that I couldn't bear to watch him in such pain. When the nurse at the emergency room desk spotted Frank's back through the window, she instantly waved us in. When she left, I placed him on a neighboring gurney while I went to get a doctor. The best I could do was hold him and tell him that everything was going to be well. I gave him a comforting smile and said, "I know it hurts, little man, but I have to ask you something." "What's going on?" "A matter-of-fact nighty-night," he replied instantly in a calm tone of voice. I was hurt by nighty-night. I was pressed for time and couldn't ask him any more questions. One look at Frank's back by the doctor was all it took for her to order a nurse to wheel him into an adjacent examination room. After I arrived, the doctor advised that I should wait outside. As she spoke, I saw that her gaze had shifted away from me and toward a security guard stationed at the other end of the hallway. I would have understood what was going on if I had been paying attention, but I was too preoccupied with Frank's safety to pay attention to what that look meant. As the nurse exited the room, the doctor entered the room. My arm was resting comfortably in hers as she walked me away from the front entrance. Of course, I objected, but she was clear that before I could see Frank, I needed to accompany her and answer a few questions. There were no pets or animals in the house, so she began by asking if there were any. She then inquired as to whether or not we had been alone when he was injured. We hadn't, so when I told her, she asked whether I'd had anything to drink that day. That was the moment when I realized what was going on and started paying attention. Staff at the hospital were attempting to figure out whether or not I had damaged my son. Our chat was interrupted by the arrival of a gray-suited man who stood next to us. It was his job to make sure that Frank was cared for in the greatest possible way, he said to them. I tried my best to answer his inquiries, but I knew he wasn't really buying what I was saying. Having no understanding what had transpired, I was unable to inform him. One of my injuries had been small enough for bandaging, but the other 2 were deep enough that I needed stitches, which the doctor informed me of once he returned from the operating room. It would be an understatement to say that I was enraged. I had no problem with her doing what was necessary for her health. I was enraged that I hadn't been allowed to be in the room with him to console him the entire time. Even as I screamed, she stood calmly by and told me that she was recommending that Frank spend the night at the hospital for observation. With a deep breath, I gently inquired about the possibility of staying with him. Neither she nor the social worker responded. He explained to me in a calm and collected manner that due to the severity of Frank's injuries, he was going to keep him with him the rest of the night while he investigated. His statements may have had a polite and measured tone, but their meaning was apparent. "You think that I wounded Frank?" I screamed, trying to fight off a second surge of rage that was brewing inside of me. There is no way I could ever do something to harm my son. If you think for a second that I'll be letting you off the hook for even a second. "Social worker, that's enough," she yelled, shutting me off. "This has to be the end of it for you. I haven't decided whether or not I believe you did it. In my experience, I've met a lot of abusive fathers, and I don't think that's how I describe you. However, I must adhere to a set of rules and regulations. We can put this behind us and move on with our lives if you go home, get some sleep, and allow me to do my job." I'd been taken by surprise by what he'd done. I kept my gaze fixed on his for a long time before finally nodding. Any deviation from his instructions would put my life in danger, and while the prospect of spending another night apart from Frank made me sick, the prospect of him being taken away forever was far worse. He rubbed my arm after I nodded one more. Before entering the examination room, he instructed me to return the next day and inquire for him at the counter. I could definitely hear Frank's voice as he opened the door and called out for me. My entire world seemed to be on fire when I walked out of the hospital. I rushed back to Frank's room as soon as I got home. I vowed to find out what had happened to him and get to the bottom of it. His sleep-induced scratches on his leg might be explained, but the injuries on his back were a different story. There's no way that he could have gotten to that part of his body. Even if he could, he would not have been able to make such deep marks. Another event had occurred. In my quest for information, I tore apart his room. If I hadn't observed the broken piece of bed or the protruding object in the toy, I would have missed the loose screw or nail. I went through the entire room, from top to bottom, and found nothing. No results were found. I couldn't locate anything that could have been the cause of his injuries. I slipped down the floor as I slumped against the wall in defeat. I leaned over and picked up a tiny stuffed duck that had caught my notice. Despite the fact that its yellow linen had faded, I could still recognize it as the first toy Beth had purchased for Frank. After we learned that she was expecting, we went out to dinner. Her pet's name was Mr. Quackers. For a duck with such a ridiculous name, it's fitting. I began to fall asleep as the day's events caught up with me. With each beat of my heart, I could feel my eyelids getting heavier. I thought this was a fantastic idea, and it was. After a good night's rest, I'd head to the hospital as soon as the sun came up. That's when I caught a glimpse of the ominous figure lurking in the room's far corner. It appeared out of nowhere, its enormously long gray body bending down and pushing against the ceiling as it pushed upwards. For a creature of its size, its limbs were incredibly long and slender. The 3 needle-like fingers on each arm must have reached a distance of 3 feet or more from the hands. The creature's face was visible as it drooped from its long neck. With dry, chapped lips that were missing bits here and there, it smiled wide to show off its pearly whites. The dried yellow collar of ancient parchment covered the areas that would have been white on a person's lidless eyes. Streams of blood from its mouth fell to the ground as it observed me. A raspy, nighty-night emitted the beast. The moment I regained consciousness, every muscle in my body twitched with excitement. In the blink of an eye, the thing had vanished without a trace. The ichor splatters on the floor had completely disappeared. My heart was beating and my breath was coming in short bursts as I sat there on the floor, all by myself in the room. I may have tried to explain what I'd seen to myself. A trick of light that my nearly unconscious mind had turned into a terrifying vision would have been a simple enough sell to convince myself that I was hallucinating. That was a logical explanation, to say the least. Seeing it was the problem. When I realized what had happened, I was certain it was real. There was no doubt in my mind about it. My gut told me that it had just been in the opposite corner from where I was standing seconds before. As a knowledge dawned on me, my terror subsided and I felt sick to my stomach. In fact, Frank had also seen it. With that horrifying expression on its face, it had watched over my 4-year-old son. As a result, he'd been injured not once, but twice. I couldn't imagine how terrified he must have been if I was this terrified. In the wee hours of the morning. Nighty Night was the nickname given by Frank. Something told me that he had heard what it had told me. It was time to leave the room, so I rose from my knees and slammed the door behind me. After a brief pause in the corridor, I dashed to the bathroom and puked in the toilet. It continued on for a long time, and I began to worry when it would end. At that point, I was near to passing out, and I collapsed against the bathtub. Frank's room shook with a loud bang. I managed to raise my chin and peer through the bathroom doorway as best I could. To my surprise, I saw the bedroom doorknob begin to turn as soon as I focused my gaze on it. The door slowly swung open with an audible click. As it grinned at me, Nighty Night's face filled up a good portion of the entryway to my room. However, I was too weak from having vomited to stand. Only Nighty Night's head could be seen pressing against the wooden frame. It couldn't fit through the door since it was so huge. Only a brief respite from the stress of the situation brought me relief. Nighty Night pushed its head even more ferociously. Slowly, but surely, its head pushed its way through. As though rubber were being driven through a hole, that's how it felt to witness. Nighty Night, it grumbled, its words coming out garbled through the tight lips. I had no choice but to leave, and I had to do it fast. Increasingly, the monster's head was making its way out of the chamber, and it wouldn't be long before it was free of its restraint. I forced myself to rise despite my aches and pains. My mind raced, and I was on the verge of collapsing, but I managed to hang on just barely. His face was nearly inside the threshold as of this writing, Nighty Night. Inadvertently, I made my way into the corridor, where I huddled against the wall directly opposite the monster. Its hot breath stinging my face as I moved past it, I tried to be as cautious as possible. My body was only a few inches away from its teeth. As soon as I got it through the narrow doorway, I dashed down the flight of stairs. The final step tripped me up. It didn't knock me off my feet, but it was enough to send me tumbling forward before I fell over the couch's edge. One of the armrests hit my skull. I'm assuming I passed out. To my surprise, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of a knock on the door. After sitting up on the couch, I was met with the worst headache of my life. The knocking went on and on. Someone was knocking on the front door, and it took me a few seconds to realize who it was. Before I realized what had happened, I'd already taken 2 steps toward the door. When I peered up the stairs, I didn't see Nighty Night making its way down the corridor toward me. I made my way over to the front door and opened it, still a little dizzy and unsure of what else to do. There was a huge police officer on the other side. He had a clipboard tucked under his arm and a pen in his other hand. His gaze was fixed on me, but he didn't smile. When he inquired about my name, I promptly provided it. As a social worker from the hospital requested, he arrived at my house and asked to see my son's room. I made room for him in the house by stepping aside. I walked him up the stairs and shut the door behind him. Frank's return was at stake if I didn't agree with his order to travel to the 2nd level, something I didn't want to do after what I'd been through. I led him to the open bedroom door and ushered him inside with me. Of course, Night Night was absent. The officer drew the clipboard from his sleeve and asked me a few questions, which I answered as best I could. My conversation with him was interrupted by him scribbling some notes on a piece of paper. He then got down on one knee and examined the safety rails that ran along the sides of Frank's bed after he seemed happy with my answers. "Since you brought your youngster to the hospital," the officer inquired, "have you done anything in this room?" When he asked what I had done, I replied, "I looked around to see what had happened." "Okay, but have you changed the sheets or anything?" "What? No. I just rearranged everything and returned them to their original locations. There was no fresh linen in the room." The staff nodded in agreement. In the end, it appears that Mr. Sanders was correct. "Is that you, Mr. Sanders?" "I'm the social worker assigned to your son. See what I mean? In spite of the lack of blood on the sheets, the safety rail has a few streaks of red paint. The poles on the train line up with them. Mr. Sanders believes that your son slipped over the rail while trying to get out of bed. The poles must have pierced him through the fabric at the proper angle. By the way, he's a cutie." A few hours into the night, His back started to hurt, and he complained he was exhausted. From there, Sanders put the pieces together. What I was hearing was completely out of character for me. Frank's statements had been misunderstood, and the theory was inaccurate. Blood trails and rail pole spacing were merely a coincidence. However, it was all working out in my favor. He went on to say, "Good thing too. In the absence of his discovery or my discovery of evidence to the contrary, I believe we would be having a very different discussion right now." The officer left the scene and returned to his vehicle, appearing to be content with the outcome. Through the window, I observed him get out of the car and head down the street. The robins in the front yard tree were chirping as the sun began to rise over the trees. I figured it wouldn't be too late to make the trip to the hospital to pick up my son. As it turned out, everything went much more smoothly than I had anticipated. Afterwards, a social worker brought me to a patient room on the other side of the hospital where I filled out a few forms to ensure that my remarks were recorded. As soon as he'd opened the door for me, Frank ran up to me barefoot, waving his medical gown in the air, and virtually leapt into my arms. The white bandages on his patched wounds were visible, so I held him back with tenderness. I was crying and he was telling me about his stint in the hospital as we stood there for what seemed like an eternity. It's been 2 months since then. Although it hasn't been on the market for very long, the house where I raised Frank is currently for sale, and my agent tells me that there are a number of people interested. She refers to it as a seller's market. It has been more than a year since that fateful night, and I've only returned twice to retrieve our stuff and store them. Both occasions occurred in the middle of the day, and I made plans for Frank to stay with someone else rather than accompany me. At a hotel on the other side of town, we've been making our home. Long term, I envision us relocating as far away from here as possible, potentially even to the shore. As far as possible, I wish to keep us from this location. In the local newspaper last week, I heard about an officer who had killed his wife. He allegedly claimed that a gigantic creature emerged in his chamber as he was about to drift off to sleep one night. He had pulled out his gun from his nightstand and fired 5 rounds at the target. But his wife, who had just walked into the room, was shot by 2 bullets and died nearly immediately. Of course, no one took him seriously. They couldn't possibly have done that. It was a ridiculous rumor to begin with. Before any formal accusations were brought against him, a psychological evaluation was required since he appeared to be telling the truth. His body was discovered in his cell 3 days later. Decapitated, to be sure, but not quite. The cops are at a loss for explanations. He couldn't have done it to himself because he was the only one in his cell. They suspect that one of the other inmates gained entry and carried out the attack. In prison, former cops don't have many pals. Just how a prisoner could get into the cell and wreak so much damage without anyone noticing is beyond their comprehension. My house had been visited by the same officer. I'm aware of what transpired. Almost occurred to both my son and me. On a nighty night like this. I believe I found out how the thing appears and disappears. Both times I saw it, I was on the edge of collapsing. 2 out of the 3 times, I was on the verge of dozing off. I was fine when I actually blacked out. According to the officer's statement, he spotted the creature in his room as he was about to go off to sleep. During the small pause between waking and falling asleep, I believe nighty night exists. You'll be able to see it when you get there. And it'll be able to glance back at you as well. Or perhaps I'm mistaken and it's always there, watching and waiting for the brief moment when your world and its are joined to come for you. I'm stumped. I don't know everything. I don't think I will ever be able to. However, it doesn't matter whether we knew exactly what Frank had been through. I won't ask him about it. Now that his wounds have healed, I'm not going to relive painful experiences that could only harm him. Everything, natural or otherwise, should be kept out of his reach. He's already been through a lot. This is not going to be the end for him, I'm afraid. While I was watching him sleep in our hotel room, I fell asleep in the chair in the corner of the room. Suddenly, something sounded out of the window to my right as I was ready to exit the building. I recognized it right away, even though it seemed like it was coming from a long way away. In the pitch black, a raspy voice shouted out, "Nighty night." I woke up in the middle of the night and promptly got up to begin collecting our belongings, making sure not to disturb Frank. He was exhausted and in desperate need of a nap. Our time on the road was going to be extensive.